There is a face carved in stone on the walls of a temple at Karnak, a face with wide cheekbones, a broad nose, a strong jaw, and eyes that stare forward with the unmistakable certainty of absolute power. The inscription beneath it reads, in hieroglyphs, the name Taharqa, Pharaoh of Egypt, son of Ra, ruler of the two lands. And he was not Egyptian. He came from the south, from a kingdom that most people today cannot place on a map, from a civilization so extraordinary that it once ruled the most empire in the ancient world, and then was written out of that story for more than 2,000 years. Taharqa ruled Egypt at its most dangerous moment. He ruled while Assyria, the most efficient killing machine the ancient world had yet produced, was systematically dismantling every kingdom that stood in its path. He ruled while the Nile flooded generously, while the harvests were full, while the temples blazed with gold and the priests chanted the old prayers in the old language. And then the Assyrians came, and the world that Taharqa had built, piece by painstaking piece, came apart in ways that no amount of religious devotion or architectural ambition could prevent. But the story of Taharqa is not simply the story of a king who fell. It is the story of a civilization that the ancient world noticed, wrote about, feared, and eventually buried, both literally and historiographically. The kingdom of Kush, which Taharqa represented, was not a minor tributary state clinging to the margins of Egyptian power. It was the largest kingdom in sub-Saharan Africa. Its pyramids still stand today, and there are more of them than exist in all of Egypt. Let that fact land. More pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt, hundreds of them. Steeper, narrower, carved from the same red sandstone that the desert itself is made of, rising from ridgelines above the Nile, in clusters so dense that the sites look from a distance like the spine of some buried creature pushing through the sand. The cities of Kush stretched along the Nile for hundreds of kilometers, through what is now Sudan, through landscapes of red sand and acacia trees and river water so green it looks painted. Its rulers were consecrated by priests, who spoke a language still only partially understood by modern scholars. Its queens commanded armies. Its metallurgists worked iron and bronze at scales that astonished ancient visitors, and its pharaohs once sat on the throne of Egypt itself, restoring temples that had fallen into ruin and reviving religious practices that the Egyptians themselves had allowed to decay. And yet, when most people think about ancient Egypt, they do not think of Taharqa. They think of Rameses, of Cleopatra, of Tutankhamun. They think of the new kingdom with its golden chariot-riding warrior kings, or the old kingdom with its pyramid builders who raised their monuments at Giza. The 25th dynasty, the dynasty that Taharqa represented, the dynasty that came from Kush, is treated as a footnote in most textbooks, a brief interruption before the story continues with someone else. It is treated, when it is treated at all, as a foreign occupation, as if Egypt had been temporarily embarrassed by a southern power before returning to its proper self. That framing is not an accident. It reflects centuries of deliberate erasure, some of it ancient and some of it distressingly modern. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon, after driving Taharqa from Egypt, ordered his name hacked from every monument he could reach, replacing the royal cartouches with blanks or with Assyrian symbols. Later ancient writers portrayed the Kushite pharaohs as usurpers who had barely a claim to the traditions they practiced. And in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Western archaeology was still constructing the grand narrative of ancient Egypt, the discipline had very specific ideas about who the great civilizations of antiquity were and who they were not. A civilization from deep in sub-Saharan Africa that had ruled Egypt, built hundreds of pyramids, developed a unique writing system, and produced some of the most sophisticated bronze and gold work of the ancient world that did not fit the story being told. So it was set aside, filed under secondary, described as derivative, mentioned briefly, and then moved past. The ruins did not cooperate with this framing. They kept being discovered, pyramid after pyramid, inscription after inscription, tomb after tomb. At Meroe, the ancient capital of the later Kushite period, the pyramids cluster so thickly on the desert ridgeline that satellite photographs of the site look almost unbelievable. A landscape bristling with stone points, dozens of them, each one covering a royal burial chamber, each one the material record of a ruler who governed a substantial territory and considered a pyramid the only adequate expression of royal permanence. At Jebel Barkal, a sacred mountain in northern Sudan that was considered the earthly home of the god Amun, temples were carved directly into the living rock of the cliff face. Temples that predate many of the structures at Luxor, temples that accumulated inscriptions across more than 1,000 years as successive rulers added their own contributions to the conversation between human power and divine authority. At Nuri, the burial ground where Taharqa himself rests beneath a pyramid whose base measured more than 51 meters on a side, the underground burial chambers have been flooded with groundwater for decades, protecting their treasures and preventing full excavation, as if the earth itself were not ready to give up its secrets. The water table in the region has been rising for a century, fed by changes in the Nile's behavior and by human alteration of the landscape. The greatest pharaoh of the 25th dynasty lies in a chamber beneath that rising water, and we have never been able to fully excavate the room where he was laid. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand that the story of Taharqa is not simply the story of one remarkable man. It is the story of what happens when a civilization is powerful enough to demand the world's attention, and what happens when that world decides, later, to look away. It is the story of how history gets written, and who gets to write it, and what gets buried not by sand alone but by choice. It is the story of a kingdom that lasted 3,000 years, ruled the most famous empire in the ancient world, built more monuments than Egypt, and was systematically reduced to a footnote. And it is the story of why recovering that truth matters. Not just for the dead, but for what it tells us about how we look at the world right now. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Taharqa, you have to understand the place that made him. And to understand that place, you have to forget almost everything you think you know about the geography of ancient Africa, because the mental map most people carry when they imagine that continent in antiquity is badly, consequentially wrong. Most people, when they imagine ancient Egypt, picture a narrow strip of green along the Nile surrounded by desert, ending somewhere around Aswan at what the Egyptians called the First Cataract, a region of rapids and granite outcroppings that made boat travel difficult and functioned as a natural southern border. Below that, the common assumption runs, was empty desert, or perhaps sparse tribal territory, with no cities, no administration, no civilization in any organized sense. That assumption was wrong, not partially wrong. Fundamentally, thoroughly, embarrassingly wrong. Below that border, along the Nile as it continued south through what is now northern Sudan, past the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th cataracts, through hundreds of kilometers of territory with its own geography and ecology and historical memory, lay one of the most consequential civilizations the ancient world ever produced. The people who built that civilization were called Kushites, named after the land of Kush, a name that appears in Egyptian records as far back as the Middle Kingdom, roughly 4,000 years ago, by current scholarly estimates. The Egyptians sometimes called this territory Nubia, from a word related to the ancient Egyptian term for gold, because the region's gold mines were famous throughout the ancient world, and the trade in that gold enriched both civilizations for millennia, across a relationship far too complex to reduce to simple subordination. But calling it simply Nubia, the way modern texts often do, misses the point by a significant margin. Kush was not just a mining territory or a trading partner. It was an independent state with its own political structures, its own religious traditions, its own artistic conventions, its own urban centers, and its own long, deep memory of what it was and where it came from. The relationship between Egypt and Kush across those 4,000 years was one of the most complex interstate relationships in the ancient world, one that swung between war and alliance, domination and resistance, cultural borrowing and fierce cultural assertion. During the New Kingdom period, which lasted roughly from 1600 to 1070, before the Common Era by current estimates, Egypt colonized the northern Kushite territories, with a thoroughness that left archaeological traces still being excavated today. Egyptian administrators built fortified towns along the Nile. Egyptian priests constructed temples to Egyptian gods in Kushite cities. Egyptian schools taught the children of Kushite elites to read and write in the Egyptian script. For a time, the cultural flow was so consistently northward to south that it genuinely seemed as though Kush might become a permanent satellite of Egypt, absorbed into its orbit. Its own identity eventually dissolved into the larger Egyptian identity. But colonization is never a simple or permanent story, and the people of Kush were not passive recipients of Egyptian influence. They were selective borrowers who took what served them and maintained what was theirs. When Egypt's new kingdom weakened during the 11th and 10th centuries before the Common Era, shattered by internal fragmentation into competing power centers, the north ruled by pharaohs who increasingly shared power with military and priestly elites, the south dominated by the high priests of Amun at Thebes, who had grown so powerful they were effectively kings themselves. Kush reasserted itself. A new ruling dynasty emerged at the city of Napata in the northern Sudan near the base of the great sacred mountain called Jebel Barkal. This dynasty did not reject Egyptian culture. They embraced it so completely that they arguably became its most devoted practitioners, and in doing so, they set the stage for one of the most remarkable political reversals in the ancient world. This is one of the strangest and most consistently misunderstood aspects of the Kushite story. The common assumption, shaped by centuries of simplified history, is that the Kushite kings were foreign conquerors who seized Egypt by military force and imposed an alien culture on a resentful population. The reality is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. By the time the Kushite kings moved north into Egypt in the 8th century before the Common Era, they had been practicing a form of Egyptian religion for generations. They worshipped Amun in elaborate Napatan style. They built temples in the Egyptian architectural tradition. They used Egyptian hieroglyphics for royal inscriptions. They observed the complex calendar of Egyptian religious festivals. In many ways, by the time they arrived in Egypt proper, the Kushite royal house was more scrupulously Egyptian in its religious practice than many of the actual Egyptian dynasts, who had allowed temple maintenance to lapse and ritual obligations to be fulfilled only nominally. To understand this fully, you need to understand what the political landscape of Egypt looked like in the mid-8th century before the Common Era. It was a landscape of extraordinary fragmentation, a landscape that would have been unrecognizable to the pharaohs of the New Kingdom who had built the empire at its height. The delta in the north was controlled by a series of Libyan-descended dynasties, the descendants of mercenary soldiers who had settled in Egypt generations earlier and gradually converted their military power into political authority. They spoke Egyptian, they used Egyptian titles, they maintained Egyptian religious forms, but their family names, preserved in the records, were unmistakably Libyan. The south was dominated by the high priests of Amun at Thebes, who had long since claimed the title of king for themselves in all but name. Between these major powers, petty rulers controlled individual cities with varying degrees of competence and stability, competing viciously with neighbors through a combination of marriage alliance, military force, and diplomatic maneuvering. Into this fragmented landscape, the Kushite king Piye, Taharqa's predecessor and the founding figure of the 25th dynasty, marched northward not as a pagan invader, but as a restorer of divine order. Piye framed his campaign explicitly as a religious mission. He came, his inscriptions declare, to liberate the temples of Amun from the ungodly rulers who had allowed them to fall into disrepair, to restore the proper performance of the rituals that maintained the cosmic order, to be the pharaoh that Egypt deserved and had not had for too long. Whether one reads this as genuine religious conviction or as sophisticated political framing, and it was almost certainly both, the practical consequence was that Piye presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a rightful heir, a son of Amun returning to claim what had been abandoned. The account of Piye's conquest of Egypt is preserved in one of the great documents of ancient history, the Victory Stele, a massive granite slab discovered in 1862 at the site of Jebel Barkal and now housed in the Cairo Museum. The stela stands more than 1.8 meters high and is covered in 169 lines of hieroglyphic text arranged in careful columns. Reading it is an experience unlike reading most ancient royal documents, because the text has an unusual quality of specificity and psychological detail that most royal inscriptions lack. Piye is not simply described as victorious. We are shown him victorious in particular places, making particular decisions, reacting to particular situations with what appears to be genuine emotional complexity. The scholar who spent the most time with this inscription in the 20th century, Nicholas Gramall, described it as the closest thing to a narrative history that Egyptian royal literature produced, and that is high praise in a tradition that otherwise ran heavily to formulaic boasting. When Piye arrives at the city of Memphis after its surrender and goes directly to the stables to inspect the horses before he does anything else, and then the text makes clear that the reason is his horror at finding them thin and neglected. That is a detail that a formulaic composition would not include. That is a detail about a specific man with specific values, a man who considered the mistreatment of horses sacred animals, associated with the divine order of warfare, to be a more immediate moral catastrophe than military resistance. Piye's successor was his brother Shabaka, who consolidated Kushite control over the entire length of Egypt and moved the administrative center northward to Memphis. Shabaka was then followed by his nephew Shibitku, who made a decision whose consequences would shape the history of the next generation. He brought the young Taharqa northward from Kush to Egypt, elevated him to a position of military and administrative authority, and placed him in the center of power at the most critical moment in the dynasty's history. The exact circumstances of Taharqa's birth, childhood, and early career in Kush before his move to Egypt are not fully documented in the surviving sources, and scholars have been cautious about reconstructing them with too much confidence. What is known is that Taharqa was a son of Piye, a junior son among many, not initially expected to inherit, and that his move to Egypt under Shibitku's sponsorship was the beginning of a transformation from a young prince of the Kushite court into the future ruler of the most powerful state in the ancient world. The distance he travelled, not just geographically but socially and politically, in those years from young prince to pharaoh is extraordinary by any standard. In approximately 690 before the Common Era, Shebitku died and Taharqa became pharaoh. The coronation ceremony would have followed the ancient Egyptian protocols that the Kushite dynasty had maintained with scrupulous care. The double crown placed on his head, the ceremonial striking of the white mace that symbolized the pharaoh's role as the destroyer of chaos, the recitation of the titulary in all 5 royal names that together constituted a complete description of the ruler's cosmic identity. His throne name was Nefertum Keper. His birth name in Kushite was Taharqa, a name with no Egyptian etymology, a reminder that no matter how complete his adoption of pharaonic role, the man beneath the crown came from somewhere the Nile flowed through long before it reached Egypt. He was, by contemporary accounts, and by the physical evidence of his surviving statues, a man of striking physical presence. The number of individual portrait statues that survive from his reign is itself notable, larger than the surviving portrait corpus of most New Kingdom pharaohs. These are not generic royal portraits with idealized features meant to represent the abstract concept of kingship rather than any specific person. The face of Taharqa as rendered by his sculptors has specific particular individual characteristics: a strong projecting jaw, a broad nose, pronounced cheekbones, full lips, and features that the sculptors of his court rendered with a specificity and a vitality that distinguishes Kushite royal portraiture from the more idealized tradition of Egyptian royal art. A visitor to the Nubian Museum in Aswan, who encounters the kneeling bronze statuette of Taharqa, small enough to hold in one's hands, technically accomplished, its surface worked with extraordinary care, is not encountering a symbol. They are encountering a person. The physical scale of Taharqa's building program was without precedent in the two lands for centuries. He did not simply maintain existing structures. He built new ones, expanded existing ones, and sent his architects to work at sites across the entire length of the territory he controlled, from the delta at Tanis in the north to the Sudanese interior at Sight's days of river travel south of the First Cataract. The most ambitious of his construction projects was his contribution to the great temple complex at Karnak, the religious center of Amun worship that the Kushite dynasty considered the most important cultic establishment in Egypt. At Karnak, Taharqa planned and partially completed a colonnade of 10 enormous columns, each reaching 21 meters in height according to architectural reconstructions. The numbers are striking: 21 meters. That is taller than a 6-story building. Each column was built from carefully cut and dressed sandstone blocks, joined with mortises and tenons, rising in diminishing courses toward a capital in the form of the open papyrus, the symbol of Lower Egypt, the north, the part of the two lands that the Kushite dynasty had most recently and most precariously acquired. Only one of those 10 columns still stands today, a single stone tower, its surface weathered and its upper portion missing, but still rising above the flat ruins of everything that surrounded it, still marking the space where Taharqa's ambition found its most visible expression in Egypt. Tour groups walk past it every day. Most of them do not know whose column it is. The guidebooks may mention it briefly. But there it stands, more than 2,600 years after the man who built it was driven from the kingdom where he built it. A stone fact that refuses to be a footnote. The wealth that funded this construction program came not only from Egypt, but from Kush itself, a detail that the standard histories consistently underemphasize. The gold mines of the Sudanese Nile, which had been producing wealth for millennia, were under Kushite royal control. The trade routes that connected the African interior to the Mediterranean world, routes that carried ivory, ebony, exotic animals, incense, precious stones, and other luxury goods northward and carried manufactured goods southward, passed through Kushite territory, and the Kushite state extracted tolls and duties from this trade on a scale that made it independently wealthy. When Taharqa built at Karnak, he was not spending Egyptian revenues on Egyptian temples. He was spending Kushite gold on an Egyptian temple, which meant that the most famous religious complex in the ancient world was being funded by a civilization that the world would later describe as peripheral. The periphery was paying for the center. There is something else about the early years of Taharqa's reign that deserves emphasis, because it tells you about both his political situation and his self-understanding. During the first years after his coronation, the Nile floods were exceptionally generous, higher and more reliable than they had been for at least a generation. This was not interpreted in the ancient world as meteorological luck. It was interpreted as divine confirmation. The flooding of the Nile was the central event of the Egyptian agricultural year, and the height of the flood directly determined the size of the harvest. A good flood meant fed people. A bad flood meant famine. When the floods of Taharqa's early reign were extraordinarily good, the inscriptions described them as unprecedented in living memory, covering the entire floodplain and reaching levels that older farmers said they had never seen. The theological implication was unmistakable. The god Amun was confirming his approval of the new pharaoh. The king's religious credentials were being validated by the river itself. This was the context in which Taharqa understood his own position, a chosen ruler, confirmed by divine blessing, descended from a line of kings who had restored the proper order of the universe, rebuilding what had fallen into decay, maintaining the cosmic machinery that kept civilization alive. The world was as it should be. The temples were full. The granaries were full. The god was pleased. He was wrong about the permanence of this state of affairs, but the forces that would prove him wrong were not yet visible on the horizon. They were approaching from the northeast, from the dry highlands of Mesopotamia, from the empire of iron and annals and systematic terror that had been building its strength for a century, and was now ready to turn its attention to the valley of the Nile. But before the Assyrians arrive in this story, it is worth pausing to appreciate something that is easy to miss in the rush toward catastrophe: the sheer human ordinariness of what Taharqa was doing during these years before the crisis descended. He was governing, he was administering, he was dealing with the mundane, persistent, relentless work of running an enormous multi-ethnic state across a territory that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of sub-Saharan Africa. The administrative documents from his reign, fragmentary and scattered, found at multiple sites across Egypt and Sudan, show a ruler deeply involved in the practical mechanics of governance, issuing decrees about land tenure, settling disputes between temples, directing the movement of goods along the Nile supply network, corresponding with officials in distant provinces, about matters ranging from the state of the flood channels to the correct performance of local festivals. There is a particular set of documents from this period that scholars have found especially revealing. Administrative texts from the temples of Upper Egypt that record the delivery of offerings, the maintenance of ritual schedules, and the movement of priests between assignments. These are not glamorous documents. They are the ancient equivalent of institutional maintenance records. But what they show is a functioning administrative machine, an apparatus capable of tracking and managing the activities of hundreds of religious establishments across the length of the Nile Valley, maintained by a literate bureaucracy that understood both the Egyptian and the Kushite traditions it was simultaneously serving. Taharqa also had a family. He had wives. The sources name at least one, a queen called Takahatenamun, a Kushite woman whose name appears in inscriptions from this period in connection with religious dedications. He had children, including the sons who were captured by the Assyrians during the fall of Memphis, a detail preserved in the Assyrian annals that carries an emotional weight the official record makes no attempt to acknowledge. Those sons, captured by Esarhaddon, were taken to Nineveh. What happened to them there, the sources do not say. He had, in other words, a life that was not simply the geopolitical abstraction that historical accounts tend to reduce rulers to. He had people he cared about, commitments he was loyal to, a religious practice that was, by every indication, genuinely held rather than merely performed for political benefit. The inscriptions from his reign that record his religious activities, his participation in festivals, his dedications to Amun, his restorations of temples that had fallen into disrepair under the fragmented dynasties that preceded him, read with a consistency and a specificity that suggests a man for whom the rituals were not theatre but reality. Understanding this, understanding Taharqa as a full human being rather than simply a geopolitical figure, is essential to understanding what his eventual defeat meant, not just to him, but to the civilization that had produced him and that would outlast him by 1,000 years. The architectural record of Taharqa's reign extends well beyond Karnak, and tracing the full footprint of his building program across the length of the Nile reveals something about the ambition and the strategy of the Kushite dynasty's approach to governance. Every major religious site in Egypt received attention. At the Temple of Mut at Karnak, Taharqa added a colonnade and a series of offering chapels. At Medinet Habu, on the west bank at Thebes, he conducted restorations to the existing structure and added new dedicatory inscriptions. At Memphis, the ancient administrative capital where he based his northern government, he worked on the Temple of Ptah, the god of craftsmen and creation, whose priesthood at Memphis had been among the most powerful in Egypt for millennia. But it is the work at sites in Kush itself that most clearly reveals the distinctive character of the Kushite royal program. At Kawa, a town in what is now northern Sudan, Taharqa built a new stone temple from the foundation, a complete temple complex, not an addition to an existing structure, dedicated to Amun in a form that combined Egyptian architectural conventions with Kushite spatial arrangements and iconographic emphasis. The temple at Kawa is one of the best preserved Kushite temples, and its inscriptions have been studied extensively by modern scholars. One of the most interesting things about those inscriptions is the way they position Taharqa in relation to both his Egyptian and his Kushite identity. He is Pharaoh of Egypt and King of Kush simultaneously, and the temple's decorative program does not try to resolve the tension between those two identities. It holds both. The inscription at Kawa that records the construction of the temple describes how Taharqa's mother, a woman named Abar, travelled from Kush to Egypt to see her son on the throne of the two lands. The text describes this visit with unusual emotional warmth, not the standard formulaic language of royal inscriptions, but something closer to genuine feeling. A son's pleasure in showing his mother the height to which he has risen, a mother's pride expressed in the formal language of a religious inscription, but legible beneath the formalities as something personal and true. Abar came from Kush. She had raised Taharqa in Kush. She had watched her son leave for Egypt with Shabitku, not knowing whether she would see him again, and then she made the journey north, along the Nile, past the cataracts, through the desert margins, to stand in the most powerful court in the world and see her son wearing the double crown. That image, a Kushite mother in the palace at Memphis, looking at her son, the Pharaoh of Egypt, is one of the most human moments in the entire ancient record of the 25th dynasty. And it is preserved because Taharqa had it written in stone at a temple in his homeland, so that the people who knew him first would know what he had become. He built monuments, in other words, not only to impress the powerful, but to remember where he came from. That is not the behavior of a man who thought of himself as an occupier of someone else's civilization. It is the behavior of a man who considered both his Kushite and his Egyptian identities genuinely his own. The religious policy of the 25th dynasty deserves extended consideration because it is central to understanding how the Kushite pharaohs understood their own legitimacy and how that legitimacy was perceived by the Egyptians they ruled. The Kushite kings did not come to Egypt as religious innovators. They came as religious conservatives, in the fullest sense of that word. They were not trying to change Egyptian religion. They were trying to restore it to what they believed was its proper form. The specific form of Amun worship that the Kushite royal house practiced was rooted in the Napatan tradition, a tradition that had developed over generations at the temples of Jebel Bakol, and that, in some respects, preserved elements of Egyptian religious practice from earlier periods that had since been modified or abandoned in Egypt itself. The Kushite kings believed, and their inscriptions state clearly, that Jebel Barkal was the original home of the god Amun. Not Karnak, not any Egyptian site, but the sacred mountain in the Sudanese desert, where the rock had been shaped by the god himself into the form of a royal uraeus. From this perspective, the Egyptian temples were not the original, they were the copies. Kush was not the periphery, it was the source. This is a theologically sophisticated position, and it had significant political implications. If the original form of Amun worship was Kushite, then the Kushite kings were not foreigners ruling Egypt. They were the rightful heirs to the oldest and purest religious tradition of the Nile Valley, returning to restore what had been corrupted by the incompetence and impiety of the dynasties that had allowed the temples to fall into disrepair. Whether the Egyptian priests and population accepted this framing is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. The evidence suggests that acceptance was mixed and complicated by social position, geographic location, and individual circumstance. The priests of Amun at Karnak, whose institutional interests were well served by a pious pharaoh who invested heavily in their temple complex, seem to have accepted the Kushite dynasty relatively readily. The Libyan-descended dynasties of the Delta, whose political independence was eliminated by the Kushite conquest, were considerably less enthusiastic. The population of the Delta cities, who had been living under stable, if somewhat fragmented local rule, had mixed feelings about the new southern pharaohs, who claimed to be restoring an order those cities had not necessarily felt was lost. The truth is that the Kushite period in Egypt was, by the standards of ancient conquest and occupation, relatively benign. There is no evidence of large-scale forced relocation, no evidence of systematic suppression of local religious practices, no evidence of the kind of organized cultural destruction that the Assyrian conquests left behind them everywhere they went. The Kushite kings wanted to maintain the temples, maintain the rituals, and collect the taxes. They were not, in the main, interested in transforming the daily lives of the people they governed. And this relative benignity, combined with the genuine religious legitimacy that their temple building and ritual maintenance gave them, made the Kushite dynasty more stable in Egypt than the political circumstances of their arrival might have suggested. Taharqa ruled for 26 years. That is longer than most modern politicians hold national office. It is longer than the reigns of many kings who are considered major historical figures. 26 years of building, governing, maintaining, praying, fighting off external threats, managing internal tensions, and navigating the increasingly dangerous geopolitics of a Near East being reorganized by Assyrian power. By any reasonable standard, it was a substantial reign, the kind of reign that in other contexts would be considered the foundation of a lasting legacy. Instead, it became the story of how a man and a dynasty reached the highest point they would ever reach, and then had to watch it all come apart. Not because they had failed at governance, not because they had failed at religion or administration or military strategy, but because the world changed around them in ways that no amount of piety or competence or gold could prevent. The word Assyria does not appear in most conversations about ancient Africa. It should, because the story of Taharqa, the story of what happened to the greatest Kushite pharaoh and to the civilization he represented, is inseparable from the story of the empire that rolled down from the northeast like a geological event, flattening everything in its path, with a combination of military innovation, administrative sophistication, and deliberate, systematic terror that the ancient world had never previously encountered at such sustained scale. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, at its peak in the 7th century before the Common Era, was the largest, most efficiently organized military state that the ancient world had yet produced. Its armies operated with a degree of logistical sophistication that would not be matched in the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. Standardized weapons and armor produced in state workshops, professional soldiers who trained year-round rather than seasonal militias called up for campaigns, an engineering corps capable of constructing bridges across rivers, siege ramps against fortified cities, and underground tunnels to undermine city walls. Its communication and intelligence networks allowed its kings to coordinate military operations across thousands of kilometers with a speed and reliability that its enemies found almost supernatural. And at the center of this machine, directing it with terrifying competence across successive reigns, were rulers whose names the ancient world learned to fear: Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal. These men were not simply warriors, they were propagandists of genius. The palace reliefs at Nineveh, many of which survive and can be seen today in the British Museum, show battle scenes of extraordinary technical quality and narrative ambition, depicting siege engines breaching city walls, prisoners led in long columns with ropes around their necks, impaled bodies lining the roads outside conquered cities as visible warnings to any population considering resistance. The Assyrian kings published their campaigns in elaborate royal annals that described their victories with a combination of bureaucratic precision and calculated boastfulness, listing conquered cities the way a merchant might list goods sold, with the same flat matter-of-factness. They understood, with a sophistication that anticipates much later thinking about power, that terror properly publicized was a weapon as effective as any army, that a city that had heard what happened to cities that resisted might choose not to resist, saving the Assyrian state the expense of a siege. Taharqa had been engaged with Assyrian pressure since before he became pharaoh. As a military commander under Shebitku, he had been involved in operations in the Levant, the strip of coastal territory that included what are now Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, where Kushi Egypt maintained a network of alliances and client states that served as a buffer zone between the Nile Valley and the increasingly aggressive powers of Mesopotamia to the northeast. The political landscape of the Levant in this period was one of small kingdoms caught between great powers, navigating desperately between Egyptian patronage and Assyrian demands, trying to remain viable through a combination of tribute, alliance, and the hope that one great power would check the other. The Bible contains a reference that most scholars now believe describes Taharqa in his pre-pharaoh military role, and it is one of the most intriguing historical connections in the ancient record. In the second book of Kings, the text describes how the Syrian king Sennacherib, during his famous siege of Jerusalem in 701 before the Common Era, received word that a military commander named Taharqa, the Hebrew rendering of the name Taharqa, was advancing to engage him. The reference is brief, but its implications are significant. Taharqa, at whatever age he was during this campaign, was already commanding forces in the Levant at the highest level, already engaged with the Assyrian military machine, already known to the Assyrian king as a serious opponent worth noting in the official record of the siege. The scholarly debate about the exact chronology of this passage, whether Taharqa was old enough at the time of Sennacherib's campaign to have been commanding forces, whether the biblical text is using his later pharaonic name for a person who was at that time simply a prince, has been extensive and has not been fully resolved. But the core fact stands. Taharqa and the Assyrian military machine had a history with each other before they met in direct confrontation over Egypt. Both sides knew what the other was capable of. Both sides had been watching, for years, the approach of a confrontation either could ultimately avoid. What was coming arrived in the year approximately 674 before the Common Era, when the Assyrian king Esarhaddon launched his first invasion of Egypt. And here is something the standard accounts almost never dwell on. Taharqa's forces repelled this initial assault. The Assyrian army was pushed back from the Egyptian border. In the brief, grudging account preserved in the Esarhaddon Chronicle, the invasion of 674 is described as failing. The Assyrian forces suffered serious defeats and had to withdraw. Taharqa held the border. He turned back the greatest military power in the world. Let that sink in. For 2 years after this defeat, the situation stabilized. The Assyrian army regrouped. Esarhaddon planned, and it is possible to imagine, that in the quieter moments of his court at Memphis or Thebes, looking out over the Nile at the harvest season, watching the floodwaters recede, and the green begin to emerge from the black alluvial mud, Taharqa allowed himself to believe that the worst had passed, that the god had intervened, that the border had held. It had not held, it had merely paused. In 671 before the Common Era, Esarhaddon invaded again, this time with the full weight of the Assyrian war machine, and with careful preparation based on intelligence gathered during the 2 years of apparent calm. The campaign records that survive describe a march across the Sinai Desert, an extraordinary logistical achievement in itself, requiring the pre-positioning of water supplies and provisions along a route where any failure of supply would have been catastrophic, followed by a series of engagements in the Delta region, and then the march south toward Memphis. The Egyptian forces engaged the Assyrians multiple times. Taharqa fought personally, was wounded in battle. The Assyrian records specify that he was struck in the face, and 2 of his sons were among the members of the royal family captured during the fall of Memphis. The city of Memphis fell, the administrative capital of Egypt for more than 2,000 years, the city of Ptah and the Apis bull, and the great palace complexes that generations of pharaohs had built and expanded, fell to the Assyrian army. And the Assyrian record of this event is a document that bears reading carefully, because its language reveals both the magnitude of the victory and the particular quality of Assyrian triumphalism. Esarhaddon's annals describe the seizure of Taharqa's family, his treasury, his gold, his silver, his precious stones, his palace furniture, his horses, and, in a phrase that has haunted subsequent readers, all his possessions without number. The phrase is not hyperbole. It is an inventory style. Everything was taken and counted, and it gets worse. Esarhaddon did not simply conquer and leave, the way that so many ancient conquests had proceeded, one army defeating another, extracting tribute and withdrawing. He installed a network of Assyrian governors and local collaborators throughout Egypt, reorganized the administrative structure to maximize tribute extraction, and erected a massive victory stele in Egypt commemorating his conquest. He had chosen his local Egyptian allies carefully, administrators and local nobles who had decided that their interests were better served by collaborating with Assyrian power than by continued loyalty to a Kushite dynasty that appeared to have been permanently defeated. He was restructuring Egypt not as a temporary occupation, but as a permanent Assyrian province. Taharqa retreated south toward Kush. He had been driven from the kingdom that his predecessor had taken by force a generation earlier, driven from the temples that he had spent 20 years and enormous resources building and restoring, driven from the administrative apparatus that he had maintained with such care. He had lost his sons to Assyrian captivity. He had lost Memphis. He had lost Egypt. And here is where the story takes a turn that most textbooks prefer to skip. He came back. Within roughly 2 years of the fall of Memphis, Taharqa was back in Egypt, moving north from his base in Upper Egypt or from Kush itself. The Assyrian occupation was stretched thin across a conquered territory of enormous size, and the local administrators that Esarhaddon had installed were men whose loyalties were fundamentally situational. When Taharqa's forces began moving north, some of those administrators began negotiating with him in secret, calculating the probabilities, weighing the risks, and concluding that a Kushite restoration was not impossible. Esarhaddon discovered the conspiracy. The intelligence apparatus that had made the initial conquest possible was still operating, still collecting information, still monitoring the behavior of the local governors. The conspirators were executed, and their deaths were publicized as warnings. But the fact that the conspiracy had existed at all, that within 2 years of the Assyrian conquest, the local administrators of Egypt were secretly negotiating with the defeated Kushite pharaoh, tells you something fundamental about the limits of Assyrian power. Winning a battle was not the same as owning a country. The annals could list every possession without number, but they could not list loyalty. Esarhaddon died in 669, before the Common Era, while preparing a second major campaign against Egypt, and this single death changed the trajectory of everything that followed. His son Ashurbanipal, who assumed the throne, was in many respects the most extraordinary of all the Assyrian kings. A man who claimed, in his own inscriptions, to be literate in multiple ancient languages, including Sumerian and Akkadian, who built at Nineveh a library of clay tablets that preserved tens of thousands of texts from across Mesopotamian literary tradition, who was simultaneously one of the most accomplished intellectuals and one of the most effective killers of the ancient world. Ashurbanipal resumed the Egyptian campaign with the organizational efficiency that characterized everything the Assyrian state did. The second major Assyrian intervention in Egypt, which occurred in the mid-660s before the Common Era, again drove Taharqa's forces southward and again occupied Memphis. Ashurbanipal's own account of this campaign, preserved in his annals, describes a systematic pursuit of the retreating Kushite forces and the reinstallation of Assyrian authority at the key administrative centers. The language of these annals, describing Taharqa's flight and the reorganization of Egyptian administration under Assyrian oversight, is vivid, precise, and utterly without sympathy. Taharqa died, probably in the early 660s before the Common Era, in the south, in Thebes or in Kush, or somewhere on the journey between them. He was buried at Nuri, on the west bank of the Nile in what is now Sudan, in the largest pyramid the Kushite royal necropolis ever produced. The pyramid's base measured more than 51 meters on a side. Its original height, calculated from the surviving remains, was approximately 47 meters. Beneath it, carved from the bedrock in the tradition that the Kushite kings had maintained for generations, was a burial chamber with stone columns, worked stone walls, and the elaborate funerary equipment that would accompany the king through the judgment of the dead and into the afterlife. His successor Tutankhamun made one final attempt to recover Egypt, marching north and briefly reoccupying Memphis. The evidence for this campaign is preserved in a remarkable document called the Dream Stele, in which Tutankhamun records a vision he received in which he saw 2 serpents, one on his right hand and one on his left, which he interpreted as a divine mandate to reclaim both the upper and lower portions of the 2 lands. He came close. He defeated the Assyrian-backed rulers at Memphis. For a moment, it appeared that the 25th dynasty might recover. Ashurbanipal's response was swift and overwhelming. His armies marched into Egypt, drove Tutankhamun south, and then, in an act of deliberate, theatrical destruction that was recorded by multiple ancient sources as among the most shocking events of the century, they sacked Thebes, the city of Noaman in the Hebrew Bible, the city of Karnak and Luxor, of the Valley of the Kings and the endless processional avenues where the statues of rams and sphinxes lined the approaches to the temple complexes. This city, which had been the religious heart of Egypt for more than 1,000 years, was systematically looted by Assyrian soldiers operating under explicit orders to strip it of everything that could be carried. Obelisks were taken, temple treasuries were emptied, objects that generations of pharaohs had dedicated to Amun were loaded onto Assyrian transport animals and carried northeast toward Nineveh. The prophet Nahum, writing in the Hebrew Bible about the destruction of Nineveh that would come decades later, used the sack of Thebes as a reference point for unimaginable catastrophe. "Are you better than Noaman?" he asked the people of Nineveh. The implication was clear. The most glorious, most sacred city in the most powerful civilization of the age had been destroyed. No city was immune from such a fate. The sack of Thebes was not a historical footnote in the consciousness of the ancient Near East. It was a historical benchmark, the standard against which other catastrophes were measured. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The sack of Thebes was not the end of Kush. The Assyrians had driven the 25th dynasty from Egypt. They had looted the greatest temple complex in the ancient world. They had demonstrated, with characteristic thoroughness, the limits of what Kushite power could accomplish against a fully mobilized Assyrian military machine. And then, within a generation, the Assyrian Empire began to fracture. The empire that had seemed invincible in 660 fell to a Babylonian Median coalition in 612 before the Common Era. The city of Nineveh, where the looted treasures of Thebes had been brought in triumph, was itself destroyed, its contents scattered, its buildings burned, its population fled. Ashurbanipal's great library, the largest collection of written knowledge the ancient world had yet assembled, survived only partially, in fragments recovered from the ruins by archaeologists 2,500 years later. Kush, which the Assyrians had humiliated, went on building pyramids. It went on smelting iron. It went on trading across the continent. It developed new artistic forms, a new script, new religious expressions. It continued, quietly and persistently, to be exactly what it had always been, a civilization rooted in a specific place, maintained by people who understood who they were and where they came from, durable in ways that military empires, for all their iron and their annals, consistently failed to be. The scholarly debate about what exactly destroyed the Kushite hold on Egypt has generated a substantial body of academic literature, and it is worth pausing here to appreciate what that debate reveals about both the nature of the collapse and the limits of the available evidence. Some scholars have emphasized the sheer material superiority of Assyrian military technology, the iron weapons, the siege engineering, the professional training of the Assyrian army, in contrast to what they characterize as a more improvised Kushite military structure. Others have pointed to the strategic vulnerability of the Kushite position in Egypt. Ruling a territory of enormous length from a home base hundreds of kilometers to the south created supply and communication challenges that made sustained military resistance against a concentrated attack difficult to sustain. The garrison at any particular Egyptian city could not expect rapid reinforcement from a Kushite heartland that was a month of travel away. Still, other scholars have highlighted the importance of the Assyrian policy of cultivating local collaborators. The Egyptian administrators and local nobles who agreed to serve as intermediaries between the Assyrian imperial structure and the Egyptian population. These local collaborators were not simply traitors or opportunists, though there was certainly an element of both in their decisions. They were men who calculated that the long-term interests of their families and their communities were better served by accommodation than by continued resistance, and they may well have been correct in that calculation. Egypt survived the Assyrian period. It survived it partly because the Assyrian preference for indirect rule through local intermediaries preserved Egyptian administrative structures and allowed Egyptian cultural and religious life to continue in modified form. Taharqa's dynasty did not survive, but Egypt did. The role of climate and ecology in this period is also worth considering because it is a factor that the ancient sources cannot be expected to have fully appreciated, but that modern scholarship has increasingly flagged as potentially significant. The 7th century before the Common Era appears to have been a period of significant climatic variation across the Near East, with fluctuations in rainfall patterns affecting both the Nile Valley and the surrounding regions. The extraordinary floods of Taharqa's early reign, The floods that seemed to confirm his divine mandate were followed by less reliable flooding in later years. Whether this represents a real climatic shift or simply the normal variability of the Nile cycle is difficult to establish from the available evidence, but the possibility that agricultural conditions in Egypt were deteriorating in the later years of his reign, creating additional stresses on the state's capacity to feed its population and fund its military operations, is one that some scholars have taken seriously. What is not in dispute is the following. By the time Tutankhamun's last attempt to recover, Egypt was crushed and the 25th dynasty ceased to exercise any meaningful power in the Nile Valley north of the First Cataract. The Kushite state faced a choice about its own identity and direction. It could define itself in terms of what it had lost. The pharaonic role in Egypt, the temples at Karnak and Memphis and Luxor, the access to the Mediterranean trade networks that had flowed through Egypt, or it could define itself in terms of what it still had. The Nile Valley south of the First Cataract, the gold mines, the iron ore, the trade routes into the African interior, the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, and a royal tradition that had been building and sustaining civilization for centuries before it ever reached Egypt. The evidence of the subsequent history of Kush, the Meroitic period, the continued pyramid building, the development of the Meroitic script, the expansion of the iron industry, suggests clearly which choice was made. Kush chose to be Kush, not Egypt without Egypt, not a defeated shadow of what it had briefly been, but the civilization it had always been, one that engaged with Egypt and borrowed from Egypt and for a time ruled Egypt, but that had its own roots, its own identity, its own reason for existing, that did not depend on any external validation. The glory of the civilization at its peak must be held against what followed, because only by doing so can we appreciate the full weight of the loss. At the moment of Taharqa's coronation, the kingdom that placed him on the throne of Egypt was the dominant power of the African continent. Its territory ran from the Mediterranean coast to the tropics. Its gold funded the greatest temple complex in the ancient world. Its armies had turned back the initial Assyrian invasion. Its pharaoh was recognized by every ruler in the Near East as the most powerful single figure in the ancient world at that specific historical moment. Within 30 years, that pharaoh was dead in the southern wilderness, buried in a pyramid that the rising groundwater would eventually begin to flood, leaving behind a civilization that would continue for 1,000 more years but would never again reach the heights of those 26 years when the kings of Kush wore the double crown of Egypt. The silence that followed the Assyrian expulsion was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a civilization regrouping, recentering, finding its new shape in the aftermath of catastrophe. But it was a silence nonetheless. A silence that covered the temples Taharqa had built. A silence that eventually covered the language in which his court had spoken and laughed and argued and prayed. A silence that ultimately covered even the knowledge of who he had been and what he had accomplished. There is a specific inscription from Taharqa's reign that deserves to be better known than it is, because it captures something essential about both the man and the moment. Discovered at the Temple of Kawa in Sudan, the inscription records what scholars call the Kawa texts, a series of commemorative inscriptions carved during the middle years of Taharqa's reign to record significant events and divine communications received by the king. Among these texts is a detailed account of the extraordinary Nile floods of the early reign, including a remarkable passage in which Taharqa describes the flooding in language that is simultaneously official and personal, language that conveys the genuine astonishment of a man who interpreted the behavior of the river as a direct communication from the divine. The text describes how the fields were covered, how the desert margins were flooded further than anyone remembered, how the animals that normally lived on the desert edge were driven to high ground, while the entire floodplain disappeared beneath the water. And then, after the flood receded and the planting began and the crops came up, there was what the text describes as a rain from heaven, falling on the fields of Upper Egypt, a phenomenon so unusual that it was remembered and recorded as a separate miracle. Rain on the fields of Upper Egypt. This is a part of the world where rain is so rare that it constitutes a religious event when it occurs. And Taharqa recorded it. There is something deeply human in that act of recording. A man at the height of his power, confirmed by the behavior of the river and the behavior of the sky, writing down the extraordinary things that had happened in his time, because he wanted them to be known, because he wanted the world to understand that the God had spoken and he had heard, and everything that came after. The building, the governing, the temple restoration, the 26 years of reign was his response to what the God had said. He could not have known, writing those texts, that they would eventually be the closest thing to his own voice, that 2,600 years of silence would leave us, that the floods and the rain he described with such careful detail would outlast the empire that drove him into exile, that a scholar working in the British Museum in the 20th century of the Common Era would read his words and feel, across that vast distance, something like recognition. The scholar Miriam Lichtheim, whose 3-volume anthology of ancient Egyptian literature remains one of the most important collections of ancient African writing in translation, wrote about the Taharqa inscriptions with a restrained but unmistakable admiration, noting their unusual combination of royal formality and what she described as personal immediacy, a quality that distinguished them from the more formulaic compositions of earlier periods. The king, she observed, was not merely performing the role of pharaoh in these texts, he was inhabiting it. He was a man who genuinely believed in what he was doing and said so, in the conventional language of the tradition, but with a directness that transcended convention. That directness is one of the things that makes Taharqa such a compelling historical figure. He was not, as far as the surviving evidence allows us to judge, a man of pretense. His religious practice appears to have been genuine. His building program was not vanity construction. It was the systematic fulfillment of what he understood to be his cosmic obligations. His engagement with the Assyrian threat was not reckless. He fought when he could win and retreated when he could not, came back when the opportunity presented itself, and refused to accept permanent defeat even when it must have seemed overwhelming. He was, in other words, exactly what his civilization had made him, a king who took his responsibilities with complete seriousness, who understood himself as the servant of the divine order rather than its master, and who spent 26 years attempting to maintain that order against forces that ultimately proved too large to hold back. The failure was not his failure. It was the failure of a civilization encountering, for the first time, a military and administrative power of a different and fundamentally larger order. And even in that failure, the civilization endured. The pyramids at Nuri still stand. The temples at Jebel Barkal still stand. The inscription at Kawa still records the extraordinary reigns of the early reign, still preserves the voice of a king who wanted the world to know that the God had spoken to him through the behavior of the river. The Assyrian annals that recorded his defeat and humiliation, those survive too, carved in cuneiform on clay tablets, housed now in museums in London and Berlin and Paris and Chicago. Both records exist simultaneously. The victor's annals and the vanquished king's devotions. The difference is that the Assyrian Empire, whose kings wrote those annals, has been gone for more than 2,600 years, and the pyramids of the civilization they defeated are still standing in the Sudanese desert, still being visited by archaeologists, still yielding new information, still insisting on being taken seriously. The physical landscape of the 25th dynasty's rule over Egypt is still present in ways that most visitors to Egypt do not fully appreciate. At Karnak, the single standing column of Taharqa's colonnade is the most visible reminder, but it is not the only one. Throughout the Karnak complex, if you know where to look, you find traces of Kushite work, restoration inscriptions in which Taharqa's cartouche appears alongside the names of the original builders, dedicatory texts in which he claims responsibility for repairing structures damaged by neglect or flood, small chapels and offering tables added to existing structures in the characteristic Kushite style that combined Egyptian forms with Kushite spatial sensibilities. The Kushite presence at Karnak is not a single dramatic monument. It is a palimpsest, a document written over previous documents Layers of care and investment accumulated over decades by rulers who considered this place the most important on earth. At Luxor, at Medinet Habu, at the Temple of Mut, at the smaller religious establishments of Thebes' West Bank, the same pattern repeats. Taharqa was everywhere at Thebes, not in the sense of overwhelming presence, but in the sense of consistent, careful, sustained attention. He was not building an ego, he was maintaining a machine. And then the Assyrians came, and the machine stopped. The priests continued their duties, because the Assyrian occupiers had no interest in disrupting religious continuity that kept the population pacified. The temples continued to function. The inscriptions continued to accumulate. But the pharaoh who had commissioned so much of the recent work was gone, and the dynasty he represented was gone, and the connection between the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal and the temples of Karnak that the Kushite kings had maintained so carefully was severed. It would never be fully restored. The 26th dynasty, which followed the Assyrian period, was an Egyptian dynasty. Saite rulers from the delta city of Sais, backed initially by Assyrian support and committed to a cultural program that looked backward to earlier Egyptian traditions rather than southward toward Kush. The Sate kings were in many respects excellent rulers, competent administrators, active builders, sophisticated patrons of art and learning, but they were not Kushite. The specific quality of religious devotion and civilizational seriousness that the 25th dynasty had brought to Egypt, rooted in a Kushite tradition that went back to Jebel, Barkal and Napata and Kerma, was gone from the throne of Egypt permanently. What remained in Egypt was stone, the column, the inscriptions, the restorations, the building program of a man who believed that maintaining the temples was the most important thing a ruler could do, and who did it with a thoroughness and a quality of attention that his successors would not match, and that the Assyrian annals could record as conquest, but could not erase from the walls of the temples themselves. The grief of this moment, the grief of watching the most carefully maintained religious program in the ancient world being stripped of the person who maintained it, is not something the ancient sources dwell on. The Egyptian priestly records of this transition, such as they are largely administrative and formulaic. The Kushite sources from the period after the Assyrian expulsion are focused on the southern territories and on the continued life of the dynasty in its Napatan heartland. Nobody wrote down what it felt like, but the stones record it anyway, in their own way. The hacked cartouches, the places where Taharqa's name was cut away by Assyrian orders and either left blank or replaced with someone else's name, are still visible at multiple sites in Egypt if you know where to look and how to read the surface of ancient stone. They are the chisel marks of deliberate erasure, the physical evidence of a defeated king's name being removed from the record of the world. And they failed, not because the erasure was incomplete, though it was, but because the temples themselves remained, and the temples were Taharqa's signature more completely than any name carved in a cartouche. Every column he raised, every wall he restored, every offering chapel he built was a signature that could not be erased by chisels, because you would have had to tear down the entire temple to remove it. The temples are still there, the column is still there, and Taharqa, driven from Egypt, buried in a flooded chamber beneath a desert pyramid in Sudan, is still there too, in the sense that his presence is still legible in the stone of the buildings he cared for. That is what it means to build not for yourself, but for the God. The building outlasts the builder. The silence that followed his death was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence of a man who had put everything he had into stone, and the stone had accepted the gift. The story of how scholars came to understand the civilization of Kush and the specific legacy of Taharqa within it is itself a story of discovery, revision, overconfidence, and ongoing humility before evidence that keeps refusing to fit preconceived frameworks. Tracing this scholarly history in some detail is essential, because the history of the research reveals not just what was found, but what was being looked for, and what assumptions were carried into the desert alongside the excavating equipment. The first European encounter with what we would now call Kushite archaeology came not from trained excavators, but from travelers, explorers, naturalists, and adventurers who came to the Nile Valley in the wake of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign and found themselves drawn further and further south by curiosity and the dimly glimpsed scale of what lay beyond the First Cataract. One of the first significant accounts came from a Scottish explorer named James Bruce, who had travelled through northeastern Africa in the 1780s and made notes on ruins he had passed. Bruce was not an archaeologist, and his notes were imprecise, but they contained enough specific observations to alert later scholars that something significant lay along the Sudanese Nile. The first person to produce genuinely detailed documentation of Kushite sites was Frédéric Caillot, a French mineralogist travelling through what is now Sudan between 1819 and 1822. Caillot was not on an archaeological mission. He had been commissioned by the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali to search for gold mines, a quest that took him deep into the Sudanese desert along routes that no European had previously travelled. He had a naturalist's eye and a systematic habit of sketching what he saw, and what he saw at the site of Meroe changed his understanding of the ancient world irrevocably. He stood before a landscape of pyramids, dozens of them, steep and narrow, rising from red sand on a rocky ridgeline above the Nile, and began to draw. Caillot's drawings of the Meroitic pyramids, published in Paris in 1826, introduced European audiences to a visual reality that most of them had simply never imagined. There were pyramids in the African interior, not the massive, smooth-sided monuments at Giza that European travellers had been visiting since antiquity, but a different kind of pyramid, steeper, narrower, with small attached chapels at their eastern faces, clearly related to the Egyptian tradition, but equally clearly distinct from it. The continent that most European scholars had confidently described as the land where civilization had not taken root was, it turned out, thick with its monuments. But the drawings could not communicate scale, and they could not communicate archaeology. For that, the Sudanese sites would have to wait another generation, until the American archaeologist George Andrew Reisner arrived in the early 20th century with the tools, the funding, and the organizational capacity to conduct systematic excavation. Reisner is one of the most complicated figures in the history of ancient African archaeology, a man of genuine technical brilliance and devastating intellectual blindness, whose work at the Kushite royal sites generated the foundational data on which all subsequent scholarship has been built, and whose interpretive framework distorted that data in ways that took decades to correct. He trained at Harvard under some of the leading Egyptologists of the late 19th century, developed his excavation methodology at a series of Egyptian sites, and brought those methods to Sudan when Harvard and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts jointly funded a series of campaigns beginning in the first decade of the 20th century. At the sites of El Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe, Reisner excavated with extraordinary thoroughness. He documented everything: the architecture of the pyramids, the layout of the burial chambers, the contents of the tombs, the construction techniques visible in the surviving masonry. His field records from the Kushite sites are still considered essential primary sources because his documentation was meticulous and because he often excavated areas that have since been damaged or destroyed by looters, by natural erosion, or by the rising water table. At Nuri, Reisner excavated the pyramid of Taharqa. The burial chamber was partially flooded when he reached it, but he was able to recover significant quantities of material. Fragments of the wooden funerary equipment that had originally been placed in the chamber, hundreds of Shabti figures, small servant statuettes made from faience and stone in the Egyptian tradition, inscribed with funerary spells, and enough architectural evidence to reconstruct the general plan of the burial complex. He found traces of a burial program that was simultaneously Egyptian in its forms and Kushite in its scale and in certain of its specific expressions. The chamber walls had been inscribed with religious texts from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but the inscriptions were placed in arrangements that differed from standard Egyptian practice in ways that suggested a Kushite scribe who knew the Egyptian texts thoroughly but organized them according to a slightly different understanding of how they should work. The Shabti figures from Taharqa's burial are among the most numerous ever found in an ancient royal burial, more than 1,000 of them, in multiple materials and sizes, representing the full range of types that the Egyptian funerary tradition had developed. The numbers are striking, over 1,000 Shabti figures for a single burial. The organizational and material investment this represents, the workshops that produced them, the scribes who inscribed them, the logistics of transporting and installing them in the burial chamber, is a measure of the seriousness with which the Kushite royal house approached the obligations of providing for the dead king's needs in the afterlife. Reisner described all of this with great technical precision, and then he explained it in a way that the evidence did not support. In his published accounts of the Kushite sites, Reisner consistently attributed the most sophisticated elements of Kushite material culture to what he described as an influx of population from the north, lighter-skinned people from the Mediterranean or Near Eastern world who he believed had introduced the higher cultural forms that the archaeological record showed. The indigenous African population, in his framework, was capable of adopting and maintaining sophisticated cultural practices, but not of originating them. The Kushite achievement was real. It was just not, in Reisner's telling, really African. This framework was not merely wrong. It was the product of a set of racial assumptions so deeply embedded in the scholarly culture of Reisner's time that most of his contemporaries did not recognize them as assumptions at all. They were, from the perspective of early 20th century Western academia, simply the obvious interpretation of the evidence. African civilization required external origin. The more impressive the civilization, the more external its origins must have been. The circular logic of this framework was invisible to the people operating within it, which is what made it so durable. The corrective began not from within mainstream Egyptology, but from its margins. In the 1950s and 1960s, a series of African scholars began arguing publicly and in print that the standard accounts of ancient African civilization were systematically distorted by racial assumptions. The most prominent of these, the Senegalese scholar Sheikh Anta Diop, made arguments that went considerably further than the evidence warranted, arguing that ancient Egypt was essentially a black African civilization in ways that most Egyptologists considered overstated, but embedded within the overclaims were legitimate and important challenges to the prevailing framework. The demand that African civilizations be assessed on their own terms, the insistence that the evidence of sophistication be taken seriously rather than explained away, the argument that the history of the ancient African world was significantly richer and more complex than Western scholarship had acknowledged. By the time the Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet began his long campaign of excavations at Kerma in the 1970s, the scholarly landscape had shifted enough that his findings, which documented a city of extraordinary sophistication predating the Napatan period, could be received and assessed, with at least some of the ideological baggage of the Reisner era having been discarded. Bonnet's work at Kerma, conducted over more than 3 decades, with a team that included archaeologists from multiple countries, produced a comprehensive picture of the city that the Egyptians had considered their most formidable southern enemy during the Middle Kingdom period. What Bonnet found at Kerma changed the chronological understanding of Kushite civilization. The city's earliest occupation layers dated to roughly 3000 before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest urban sites in sub-Saharan Africa. At its peak, around 1600 before the Common Era, Kerma covered an area of perhaps 2 square kilometers and supported a population that some scholars estimate in the tens of thousands. The central religious structure, the Western Defufa, a massive mud brick tower that still stands today to a height of roughly 18 meters, is one of the largest pre-modern mud brick constructions in the world. It is not a pyramid, it is not an Egyptian form at all. It is something native to the Nile Valley south of the First Cataract, a form developed by the people of Kush before Egyptian influence penetrated the region deeply. The royal burial tumuli at Kerma were among the most extraordinary discoveries of the entire excavation. The tumuli, large circular earthen mounds built over underground burial chambers, contained not only the royal burials themselves, but the remains of hundreds of sacrificed individuals. These were not random burials. They were carefully arranged, placed in specific positions relative to the central burial, representing the full social hierarchy of the Kerma court in death as in life. Servants, soldiers, musicians, craftspeople, all apparently accompanied the king in death according to a funerary ideology that required the physical presence of the court in the afterlife. The discovery of these mass burials shocked the archaeological world when it was first announced, because nothing in the existing literature on Kushite civilization had prepared scholars for evidence of royal funerary practice on this scale. Bonnet himself, reflecting on the experience of excavating the Kerma tumuli, wrote about the vertigo of discovery, the feeling, in the midst of carefully documenting something extraordinary, of realizing that the framework one had brought to the excavation was not adequate to what one was finding. Every season at Kerma, he wrote in a retrospective account of his work, the site revealed itself to be larger and more complex than the previous season's work had suggested. We kept revising our estimates upward, the population, the area of the city, the duration of the occupation, the sophistication of the material culture, and every revision moved the site further from the secondary status that the older literature had assigned to it, and closer to the category of a major ancient civilization in its own right. That is the voice of a scientist being honest about the experience of allowing evidence to change understanding. It is a voice that appears relatively rarely in the Kushite archaeological literature before the last few decades of the 20th century, which makes Bonnet's candor all the more valuable. The city of Meroe and its industrial legacy deserve extended attention here because they represent the post-Egypt phase of Kushite civilization and demonstrate with particular clarity what the Kushite state was when it was not performing its role as pharaoh of Egypt, when it was simply being itself, building and trading and governing according to its own priorities and on its own terms. Meroe sits on the east bank of the Nile in central Sudan, approximately 200 kilometers northeast of modern Khartoum, in a region where the river bends eastward and the landscape transitions from the pure desert of the north to a semi-arid zone where seasonal rains support sparse grass and acacia woodland. The Nile here is different from the Nile of Egypt, wider in places, shallower in others, with a different character of flooding and a different quality of light. The annual rainfall at Meroe, though modest, was enough to support rain-fed agriculture in the fertile zones near the river. Agriculture that was less dependent on the flood cycle than Egyptian farming, and that gave the Meroitic state a degree of agricultural diversity that the purely flood-dependent economy of Egypt lacked. The city grew gradually over centuries, reaching its maximum extent during the Meroitic period, roughly 300 before the Common Era to 300 of the Common Era by current scholarly estimates. At its peak, Meroe covered several square kilometers, with a royal palace complex on the riverbank, a temple precinct dedicated to Amun, that was the most important religious establishment in the Meroitic state, and extensive residential and industrial zones that spread across the flat terrain around the central area. The ironworking industry at Meroe was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The slag heaps left by the smelting operations, enormous mounds of waste material from the iron reduction process, are visible at multiple locations around the city site, and their volume has been estimated by archaeological surveys at several million tons across the whole site. This is not a small-scale artisan activity. This is industrial production on a large scale, sustained over centuries. The iron produced at Meroe was not simply used locally. It fed a trade network that distributed iron tools and weapons across a vast territory, connecting the Meroitic economy to the agricultural and pastoral communities of sub-Saharan Africa in ways that the surviving archaeological evidence is still only beginning to document. The archaeologist Shini, who conducted systematic excavations at Meroe in the 1960s, described the slag heaps as among the most striking visual features of the site. Hills of iron waste, he wrote, that dominate the landscape around the ruins the way that industrial waste heaps dominated the landscapes of Victorian England. The comparison is pointed. What Shini was describing was a pre-modern industrial centre, a place where the systematic extraction and processing of a key raw material was organized at a scale that required substantial capital investment, significant technical expertise, and reliable access to fuel in the form of the hardwood charcoal that the iron smelting process consumed in enormous quantities. The fuel question is one that has received increasing attention in recent scholarship because it has direct implications for understanding both the scale of Meroitic iron production and the environmental consequences of that production. Iron smelting requires large quantities of charcoal, and charcoal production requires trees. The landscape around Meroe today is largely bare of the mature woodland that would have been necessary to sustain iron production on the scale the slag heaps imply. Was this deforestation caused by the iron industry? Was it a cause of the eventual collapse of Meroitic civilization, a civilization that consumed its own environmental foundations? The evidence is not conclusive, but the question is not frivolous. The math is striking. If the slag heaps at Meroe represent several million tons of iron waste, and if each ton of iron waste required several tons of charcoal to produce, and if each ton of charcoal required perhaps 10 tons of wood to manufacture, then the iron industry at Meroe consumed the equivalent of a forest covering hundreds of square kilometers over its centuries of operation. The Meroitic script presents one of the most tantalizing and frustrating puzzles in the archaeology of ancient Africa. The script was developed sometime around the 3rd century before the Common Era, adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphs but used to write a completely different language, the native language of the Meroitic people, which had no relationship to Egyptian, but whose phonetic values could be approximately expressed using a system derived from the Egyptian writing tradition. The script exists in 2 forms, a monumental hieroglyphic form used for formal inscriptions, and a cursive form used for everyday documents, funeral stelae, and the texts that appear in large quantities at the major Meroitic sites. Francis Llewellyn Griffith, a British Egyptologist working in the early 20th century, deciphered the phonetic values of the Meroitic signs in 1911, a genuine achievement that allowed the script to be read aloud, sound by sound, from surviving inscriptions. But reading aloud is not the same as understanding. The language behind the sounds, the grammar, the vocabulary, the meaning of the words, remained completely opaque. It remains largely opaque today. There have been attempts to relate Meroitic to various known African language families. None has achieved scholarly consensus. There are thousands of Meroitic inscriptions. Most of them are unreadable in any meaningful sense. The implications of this for understanding Taharqa and his civilization are profound, because it means that a large portion of the documentary record of Kushite civilization, specifically the portion produced after the Assyrian expulsion, when the Kushite state developed and used its own indigenous writing system, is effectively closed to us. The thoughts, the theology, the history, the literature of the Meroitic period exist physically in the inscribed stone, and the inscribed obelisks, and the inscribed pottery, and the funeral stelae of hundreds of burial sites across Sudan. They are there, preserved in stone, waiting, and we cannot read them. The most recent generation of excavations in the Kushite heartland has employed techniques that were unavailable to Reisner and even to Bonnet in his early seasons. Ground-penetrating radar that can identify subsurface structures without excavation, multispectral satellite imaging that reveals crop marks and soil anomalies invisible to ground observation, isotope analysis of skeletal remains that can track the geographic origins and dietary histories of individuals, DNA analysis that is beginning to address questions about population, continuity, and movement that could not previously be investigated through material culture alone. The results of these new approaches have been, without exception, in the direction of expanding our appreciation of the scale and sophistication of Kushite civilization. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at the Napatan sites around Jebel Barkal have revealed the outlines of structures that have never been excavated, walls, rooms, courtyards, extending across areas that earlier archaeological surveys had classified as empty desert. At Meroe, satellite imaging has identified residential zones and industrial areas that extend the city's footprint significantly beyond the areas previously mapped from ground survey. The site is larger than we thought. The civilization is larger than we thought. This keeps happening every time new methods are applied to the old sites. Timothy Kendall, the American archaeologist who has spent decades working at Jebel Barkal and who has done more than perhaps anyone else to communicate the significance of Kushite civilization to a general audience, has described the experience of working at the sacred mountain as one of continuous discovery and continuous revision. He has written about climbing to the top of Jebel Barkal at dawn and looking out over the desert landscape that stretches in every direction, the flat plain punctuated by the outlines of buried structures visible as subtle changes in the color and texture of the sand. Everything visible, he has said, is the surface of something much larger that is not yet understood. That image, the surface of something much larger that is not yet understood, captures something essential about the entire Kushite story. We are looking at the top layers of a civilization that is still mostly buried. The excavations of the past 2 centuries have recovered an extraordinary amount, but the amount that remains unexcavated, unstudied, unpublished, or simply underwater is at least as large and possibly larger. The groundwater problem at Nuri, which has partially flooded the burial chambers of Taharqa and multiple other Kushite royal burials, is not simply an archaeological inconvenience. It is a race against time. The water table continues to rise, and with it the threat that organic materials in those chambers, materials that might include wooden furniture, textiles, papyrus documents, or leather goods, are being slowly destroyed. Every year that passes without excavation is a year in which the evidence base for understanding Kushite civilization is diminishing. The recent formation of a dedicated conservation and excavation project focused specifically on the flooded tombs at Nuri, a project involving institutions from multiple countries and using pumping technology to temporarily lower the water table around specific tombs, represents perhaps the most important current archaeological initiative in the region. The results of this project, when they are fully published, are expected to significantly expand our understanding of Taharqa's burial program and of the royal ideology of the 25th dynasty. What will be found in the submerged chambers of the greatest Kushite pharaoh's tomb, no one can yet say. But the fact that archaeologists are finally, after more than a century of the site being known and studied, getting close enough to find out, that is itself a form of justice. The question of what the Kushite state looked like in its later Meroitic phase, after the Assyrian expulsion, after the capital shift southward, after the development of the independent Meroitic script, is one that recent scholarship has approached with increasing sophistication and an increasing willingness to look at the evidence without the distorting lens of the older frameworks. The Meroitic state at its height, roughly from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 2nd century of the Common Era, was a territorial entity of considerable size, governed by a royal dynasty whose longevity is itself remarkable. The same royal line, tracing its descent from the Napatan kings and before them from the 25th dynasty, maintained control of the Meroitic state for the better part of 1,000 years. 1,000 years of continuous dynastic rule. To put that in perspective, 1,000 years ago from today would place us in the early 11th century of the Common Era, before the Norman conquest of England, before the Crusades, before the Mongol Empire. Everything since then, the entire European Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the 20th century, would fit into the span of the Meroitic dynastic succession. The rulers of the Meroitic state were not simply kings, they were pharaohs in the full Kushite understanding of that office. Cosmic intermediaries between the human world and the divine order, responsible for the maintenance of the temples, the performance of the rituals, and the welfare of the entire territory. The iconographic program of Meroitic royal art, which can be studied in the surviving temple reliefs and the funerary stelae of the burial sites, shows rulers depicted in the elaborate regalia of the pharaonic tradition. The double crown, the crook and flail, the cartouche with the royal name, but also in distinctly Kushite forms that had no Egyptian precedent, including elaborate costumes decorated with symbolic motifs, that scholars are still working to fully interpret. The role of women in Meroitic royal governance is one of the most striking features of the political system, and one that distinguishes it sharply from the pattern of most ancient states. The Meroitic sources, both the unreadable inscriptions and the visual evidence of the royal art, show women in positions of power that go considerably beyond the ceremonial roles that Egyptian queens typically occupied. The title Kandaki, often transliterated as Candace in ancient classical sources, and used by some later writers as if it were a proper name rather than a title, referred to the queen mother or the ruling queen, and the evidence suggests that at least some Kandakes exercised genuine governing authority, not merely ritual significance. Classical Greek and Roman writers recorded accounts of powerful Meroitic queens with enough consistency and detail to suggest that the phenomenon was real and visible to outside observers. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described a ruling queen of Meroe as a formidable military leader. Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament references a Candace of the Ethiopians, the classical term for the peoples of the Nile Valley south of Egypt, whose treasurer was travelling to Jerusalem, an incidental detail that speaks to the integration of the Meroitic state into the commercial and diplomatic networks of the ancient world. The image of a powerful African queen commanding armies and conducting international diplomacy was not, in the ancient world, a fantasy or an idealization. It was a political reality that multiple independent sources attested. The Meroitic economy was structured around the nexus of agricultural production, artisan manufacture, and long-distance trade that characterized most successful pre-modern states, but its particular geographic position gave it advantages that states with more limited territorial reach could not access. The Nile, which ran through the heart of Meroitic territory, was not only the source of agricultural fertility and the main artery of internal communication, it was also the key trade route connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. Everything that came northward from the African interior, ivory from the elephant populations of Central Africa, iron from the Meroitic furnaces, ebony, exotic animal skins, incense from the southern highlands, gold from the eastern desert deposits, passed through Meroitic territory. The state extracted value from this trade at multiple points, through duties and tolls, and the direct royal monopoly on certain high-value goods. The wealth generated by this trade funded not only the royal building program, but a level of artisan production that has consistently astonished archaeologists and museum visitors. Meroitic gold jewelry, found in royal burials and in the burials of high-status individuals throughout the Meroitic territory, combines technical sophistication with aesthetic inventiveness in ways that rival the finest work of any ancient tradition. The gold workers of Meroe mastered granulation, the technique of applying tiny beads of gold to a gold surface to create patterns of extraordinary delicacy, and the cloisonné technique of setting coloured stones within gold frameworks. The surviving examples of Meroitic gold work, now distributed among museum collections in Khartoum, Berlin, Boston, and elsewhere, are objects of genuine beauty that need no archaeological context to be appreciated as works of art. The pottery tradition of the Meroitic period is equally remarkable. The fine pottery produced in Meroitic workshops, wheel-made, fired at high temperatures, decorated with painted designs in a palette of black, red, and white, is technically accomplished and aesthetically distinctive, with a visual language that combined Egyptian and indigenous Kushite symbolic traditions with African decorative motifs that have no parallel in the Egyptian repertoire. Scholars who have studied this pottery in detail have argued that it represents a genuinely original artistic tradition, not Egyptian pottery with African modifications, but a new synthesis that expressed a new cultural identity. This is the pattern that runs through the Meroitic evidence in every medium, synthesis and originality coexisting, the Egyptian tradition present as an acknowledged ancestor, but not as a constraint. The Meroitic rulers used Egyptian hieroglyphs for certain form of inscriptions and their own Meroitic script for others. They depicted themselves in Egyptian royal regalia and in specifically Kushite forms. They built temples that followed Egyptian architectural principles and temples that departed from those principles in significant ways. They worshipped Amun, the Egyptian god of their ancestors, and they worshipped Apedimак, a specifically Kushite deity, a lion-headed warrior god with no Egyptian counterpart, with equal devotion. They were not confused about who they were. They were a civilization that knew its origins, respected its inheritances, and was not afraid to go beyond them. That confidence, the confidence of a civilization secure enough in its own identity to borrow freely without being absorbed, is perhaps the most remarkable quality of the long Kushite tradition. It is what allowed Piye to march into Egypt and present himself as the restorer of an Egyptian religious tradition that he considered his own inheritance. It is what allowed Taharqa to build at Karnak in a style that was simultaneously Egyptian in its forms and Kushite in its energies. It is what allowed the Meroitic kingdom to develop its own script, its own art forms, its own political system, its own religious expressions, while maintaining the continuous thread of connection to the ancient civilization of the Nile Valley that had formed the foundation of the entire tradition. And it is, ultimately, what makes the erasure of this civilization from the standard accounts of ancient history so difficult to understand and so important to correct. A civilization of this depth and this duration, of this cultural sophistication and this political accomplishment, of this artistic achievement and this historical significance. There is no archaeological or historical justification for treating it as a footnote. There is no excuse in the 21st century for a reasonably educated person to have never heard the name Taharqa. The evidence has been there for a century. What has been missing has not been the data, but the will to take it seriously. The will is beginning to catch up with the data. The new generation of Kushite scholarship, represented by researchers like Jefer Emberling at the Oriental Institute, by Salah Ahmed Mohammed Ahmed and his colleagues at the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums in Sudan, by the international teams working at Nuri and Meroe and Kawa and Kerma, is producing a literature that treats Kushite civilizations with the same rigor and the same respect that the Mediterranean, ancient world has always received. The new excavations are finding things that surprise even the most knowledgeable scholars. The new analytical techniques are revealing aspects of the material culture that conventional excavation could not access. And the new interpretive frameworks are allowing the evidence to speak more directly, with fewer of the distorting assumptions that shaped the older accounts. The story is not over, in the most literal sense. The chambers at Nuri have not all been excavated. The inscriptions at Jebel Barkal have not all been fully documented. The sites identified by satellite survey around Meroe have not been tested by ground excavation. The story is still being written, and that is, in its way, one of the most hopeful things about the archaeology of ancient Africa. The best discoveries may not yet have been made. The site of El Kuru, located approximately 13 kilometers downstream from Jebel Barkal, is the earliest royal necropolis of the Napatan dynasty, and therefore the physical foundation of the tradition that produced Taharqa. This is where the rulers of Kush were buried before the tradition of pyramid construction was fully established, in tombs that evolved over generations from simple pit graves to increasingly elaborate underground chambers covered by tumuli, and then by the stepped pyramid structures that would eventually become the characteristic Kushite royal burial form. Reisner excavated El Kuru extensively in the early 20th century, and his reports documented a sequence of royal burials that allowed scholars to reconstruct the dynastic succession of the early Napatan period with unprecedented clarity. Among the most extraordinary finds at El Kuru were the horse burials. 4 separate deposits of buried horses, arranged in standing positions, facing north, were discovered in the cemetery. The horses were wearing elaborate bridles and trappings, their equipment decorated with gold and silver and precious stones. They had been killed at the time of the royal burial and interred with the same formality as human servants, not as possessions, but as honoured companions, as beings whose status in the afterlife required the same careful provision as their owners. The discovery of the horse burials at El Kuru connects directly back to that detail from Piye's victory stele. the passage where Piye, upon entering the stables of a defeated Egyptian ruler, finds the horses thin and neglected and is more offended by this than by anything else the conquest has revealed. The horse was not merely a military tool for the Kushite dynasty. It was a sacred animal, an animal whose welfare was directly related to the moral standing of the ruler who owned it, an animal whose proper care was an index of the proper care of the divine order itself. The horses buried at El Kuru, carefully laid to rest, facing north toward Egypt, adorned with their best equipment, were being provided for in the afterlife with the same theological seriousness that governed every other aspect of the Kushite funerary program. The inscriptions on the walls of the tomb chambers at El Kuru, at Nuri, and at the later Meroitic royal cemeteries are another resource that scholars have been mining with increasing sophistication. Many of these inscriptions are in Egyptian, the religious texts that accompanied the Kushite kings on their journey through the afterlife were drawn from the Egyptian funerary tradition, from the Book of the Dead and from the pyramid texts, and from the Book of Gates and other ritual compilations that the Egyptian tradition had developed over millennia. But the Kushite scribes who copied these texts into the burial chambers did not simply reproduce them unchanged. They made selections, combined texts, in ways that had no Egyptian precedent, and in some cases composed new passages in the Egyptian language that expressed specifically Kushite religious ideas in Egyptian literary form. The scholar John Coleman Darnell, working on the funerary texts from the Kushite royal burials, has argued that the Kushite engagement with Egyptian religious literature was not passive reproduction but active intellectual engagement, that the Kushite scribes were reading the Egyptian texts carefully, thinking about what they meant, and making creative choices about how to use them that reflected a sophisticated understanding of the tradition. The Kushite use of Egyptian religious texts, Darnell has written, is not the behavior of cultural imitators. It is the behavior of people who understood the tradition deeply enough to know when and how to depart from it. That is, the observation of a scholar being forced by the evidence to revise upward his estimate of the intellectual sophistication of the civilization he is studying. The question of what made the Kushite dynasties hold on Egypt ultimately unstable, setting aside the purely military reality of Assyrian superiority, is one that has generated considerable scholarly discussion because the answer has implications for how we understand the nature of the Kushite political project. Some scholars have argued that the Kushite dynasty in Egypt was always fundamentally Sudanese in its self-understanding, that it never fully integrated into the Egyptian political culture, that it remained culturally oriented toward its Napatan homeland, and that this cultural orientation limited its ability to develop the deep roots in Egyptian society that would have been necessary to withstand the Assyrian challenge. On this reading, the Assyrian expulsion was not simply a military defeat, but the revelation of a political limitation that had been present from the beginning. Other scholars have pushed back against this reading, arguing that the evidence for the 25th dynasty's integration into Egyptian political culture is considerably stronger than the first view allows. The building program, the religious policy, the administrative records, the degree to which the Kushite kings adopted and maintained Egyptian institutional forms, all of this points to a dynasty that was making a serious and largely successful attempt to be Egyptian as well as Kushite. The problem on this reading was not that the Kushite dynasty was too foreign to hold Egypt, but that the Assyrian military machine was too powerful for any dynasty to resist. Egyptian, Kushite, or otherwise, both of these readings have merit, and the truth probably lies in the tension between them rather than in either extreme. The Kushite dynasty was genuinely bicultural, genuinely both Kushite and Egyptian, and this biculturalism was both a source of strength and a source of vulnerability. The strength was the flexibility it gave them in managing a diverse and complex polity. The vulnerability was that the Kushite heartland, which remained the dynasty's emotional and religious center, was physically distant from the northern territories they needed to defend against Assyrian pressure. When the crisis came, the distance between Napata and Memphis, more than 1,000 kilometers of Nile, through multiple cataracts across desert margins was an insurmountable logistical challenge. But here's the problem with any simple account of why the Kushite dynasty lost Egypt. It ignores what they built. It focuses on the endpoint, the Assyrian expulsion, and works backward from that endpoint to construct an explanation for why the outcome was inevitable. The lives of the people who lived through those 50 years of Kushite rule in Egypt did not feel like the prelude to an inevitable defeat. They felt like the normal texture of life in a functioning state. The floods coming and going, the markets opening and closing, the priests performing the rituals, the craftspeople producing the goods, the children being born and growing up and making their lives. Taharqa's 26 years on the throne of Egypt were 26 years of actual governance, actual building, actual devotion, not a historical interlude between two more significant episodes, but a complete and substantial historical reality in its own right. The 50 years of the 25th dynasty, from Piye's conquest to Tutankhamun's final expulsion, were, in the experience of the people who lived them, the normal time of their lives. They did not know they were living in a footnote. They were living in a civilization. The fact that later history would treat their civilization as peripheral is a problem with later history, not a reflection of the reality they inhabited. The most recent development in the archaeology of the Kushite heartland, the ongoing work at the site of Meroe, using the new technique of magnetometry, which can map buried structures without excavation by detecting differences in the magnetic properties of the soil, has revealed an urban landscape significantly larger than previous surveys indicated. Structures buried under the desert surface extend well beyond the limits of the previously mapped city, suggesting that at its peak Meroe was home to a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people. This would make it one of the largest cities in the ancient world at that time, comparable in size to Alexandria or Antioch, far larger than any contemporary city in Europe. A city of 100,000 people in the Sudanese desert, at a time when Rome was still consolidating its hold on the Mediterranean. That is the scale of what we have been calling a footnote. The evidence of Meroe's size and sophistication continues to accumulate. Each season of new survey work adds detail to the picture of a city that was, in its time, a major node in the network of long-distance trade and communication that connected the ancient world from the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa. And each new detail serves as another reminder of how much was lost when the Meroitic state finally collapsed in the 4th century of the Common Era, lost not in a single catastrophe but in the slow, quiet, unrecorded way that most civilizations lose their vitality, through a combination of factors that include the external pressure of the rising Aksumite kingdom, internal political fragmentation, possible environmental degradation, and the simple passage of time. The last pyramid was built at Meroe sometime in the mid-4th century of the Common Era. It is smaller than the earlier ones. Its construction is less careful. The inscriptions are fewer and simpler. It is the burial of a ruler who was still performing the ancient forms, still insisting on the pyramid as the correct expression of royal permanence, but doing so with fewer resources and less organizational capacity than the great rulers of the earlier periods. And then there are no more pyramids. The last ruler buried in a pyramid disappears from the record. The tradition ends, not with a conquest, not with a catastrophe that the ancient sources record with the same horror they used for the sack of Thebes, just with a last-darned pyramid and then silence, the worst kind of silence. There is a question that lies beneath all the archaeology, beneath all the dates, and the pyramids, and the iron slag heaps, and the undeciphered inscriptions. It is not an archaeological question. It is something closer to a moral one. The question is, why did the forgetting happen? Not the forgetting that comes from the natural processes of decay and burial, not the sand that covers ruins or the flood that fills burial chambers, but the modern forgetting. The scholarly forgetting, the textbook forgetting, the forgetting by omission and by misinterpretation that ensured most educated people in the 21st century have never heard of Taharqa, despite the fact that he ruled the most powerful state on earth at his time, despite the fact that he is mentioned by name in the Bible, despite the fact that his monuments still stand in Egypt and Sudan. Let that sink in. A man who ruled Egypt, whose name appears in the oldest religious texts in the Western canon, whose building program left marks on Karnak that are still visible to every tourist who walks through that temple complex today. A man whose pyramid is larger than any structure his Assyrian conquerors ever built for their own kings. And most people do not know his name. The erasure of Taharqa is not a mystery in the way that the collapse of the Bronze Age is a mystery, or the way the abandonment of Mohenjo-Daro is a mystery. It is not a puzzle for which we lack data. We know quite precisely how and why it happened. It happened in layers, each one adding to the obscurity, each one making the recovery of the truth a little more laborious. The first layer was ancient. Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal had Taharqa's name hacked from monuments they could reach, replacing his cartouches with blanks or with Assyrian symbols. The message was unambiguous. This man did not rule here. This never happened. The only pharaoh the monument should remember is the one the annals recorded as victorious. The Assyrian record of the conquest of Egypt is a record of victory over a barely named adversary. When the later Greek writer Herodotus compiled his account of Egyptian history in the 5th century before the Common Era, he listed some of the 25th dynasty rulers but compressed the Kushite period significantly, treating it as an interval of minimal consequence between episodes of Egyptian self-rule. The second layer was the architecture of classical learning. As the Greek and Roman world established its intellectual framework for understanding antiquity, Egypt was absorbed into that framework as the great ancient civilization, the exotic, magnificent, hieroglyph-covered source of wisdom and mystery that European and Mediterranean cultures had been writing about since Herodotus. But Egypt in this framework was always Egypt as seen from the north, from the Mediterranean, from the perspective of travelers and conquerors and merchants who came from the delta side. The civilizations further south, the civilizations of the Nile Valley above the First Cataract, were described in the classical sources in language that combined vague admiration with reliable ignorance. The term Ethiopia, which the Greeks applied loosely to sub-Saharan African peoples, told you more about Greek geographical confusion than about the actual civilizations it gestured toward. The third layer is the most painful, because it is the most recent and because its consequences are still being worked through. The 19th and early 20th century construction of Egyptology as a professional academic discipline occurred within the context of European colonialism in Africa. The men and women who first systematically excavated the major Kushite sites were Europeans working in territories under British, Italian, or Egyptian colonial administration. They brought with them the intellectual furniture of their era, assumptions about the relationship between race and civilization, about the capacity of African peoples for complex social organization, about who in the ancient world deserved the credit for the things they built. These were not fringe views. They were mainstream scholarly positions, taught in leading universities, published in leading journals, defended by people whose technical competence was genuine and whose intellectual limitations were invisible to themselves, precisely because the framework they were operating within was considered natural by everyone around them. When George Reisner attributed the sophisticated elements of Kushite material culture to hypothesized northern populations, he was not being eccentric. He was being orthodox. The orthodoxy was wrong, but it was powerful enough to shape the interpretation of the evidence for decades after the evidence itself had been fully collected. This is not science fiction. This is traceable, documented intellectual history. You can read it in the published literature. Watch the assumptions operating in real time as scholars describe extraordinary things and then explain them away in the same paragraph. Let that sink in. The largest pyramid-building civilization in the history of the world, larger than Egypt's, more enduring than Egypt's, and the scholars excavating it spent the first 50 years of the modern research program explaining it as the product of people who were not really from there. The cost of this intellectual failure has been real, not abstract and not merely academic. The erasure of Kush from the standard accounts of ancient civilization contributed to a broader narrative about Africa that served the interests of colonial power. If Africa had no ancient civilizations of its own, or only derived ones, copies of Egyptian originals, requiring external explanation, then there was nothing to lose by colonizing it, nothing being destroyed that had not already been lost long ago. The archaeology of Kush provided evidence that directly contradicted this narrative. The evidence was suppressed, misread, and explained away. The narrative was maintained. Recovering the truth of Taharqa and of Kush is therefore not simply an exercise in historical correction, important as historical correction is in its own right. It is an attempt to repair something that was deliberately broken, a strand of the human record that was cut not by time or by natural disaster but by choice, by the sustained, institutional preference of a discipline for an account of the past that served the ideological needs of the present. The repair is partial and ongoing. The new scholarship on Kush is serious, rigorous, and growing. The new excavations are finding things that change the picture. The new museums in Sudan, particularly the Nubian Museum at Aswan and the National Museum in Khartoum, are presenting the material culture of Kush to audiences that include Sudanese schoolchildren who can see, in the faces of the royal statues, their own faces looking back at them across 2.5 millennia. That connection, the connection between a child in Khartoum and a pharaoh who ruled Egypt before the Assyrians came, is not a sentimental fantasy. It is a documented historical relationship. The people who live along the Nile in northern Sudan are the descendants of the people who built the pyramids at Meroe, who maintained the temples at Jebel Barkal, who produced the extraordinary goldwork that now sits in museum display cases in multiple countries. Their ancestors were not peripheral. Their ancestors ruled the world. The philosopher of history Paul Ricoeur wrote extensively about what he called the wounded memory of peoples whose historical experience has been suppressed or denied, the way that the absence of recognized history creates a particular kind of damage to collective identity, a damage that is different from, and in some ways, more insidious than the damage of acknowledged trauma. When the history is denied, the wound cannot be named. When the wound cannot be named, it cannot be healed. The recovery of Kushite history, the scholarly recovery, the popular recovery, the recovery into school books and documentaries, and the conversations that happen between parents and children, is therefore not simply an intellectual exercise. It is part of a larger process of naming wounds that have been left unnamed for too long. The most unsettling reality in the Taharqa story, the one that builds in the background across everything that has been described, is this: the civilization that the world forgot was not only extraordinary in its achievements, it was extraordinary in its values. The Kushite religious tradition, as expressed in the building program of the 25th dynasty, was oriented toward maintenance and restoration rather than conquest and exploitation. Taharqa did not go to Egypt to extract resources from it. He went to Egypt because his religious tradition taught him that maintaining the temples of Amun was an obligation of cosmic importance, that the correct performance of the rituals in the correctly maintained temples was what kept the world functioning. He spent his 26 years on the throne and his considerable personal fortune trying to fulfill this obligation. The Assyrians, who defeated him, were oriented differently. Their empire was extractive by design. Its entire administrative and military structure was organized around the efficient removal of wealth from conquered territories and its concentration in the imperial center. They were extraordinarily good at this. They were so good at it that the wealth they extracted funded a cultural program of remarkable sophistication at Nineveh, including the great library of Ashurbanipal that preserved so much of the literary heritage of the ancient Near East. The contradictions of power are never simple. But the Assyrian Empire lasted 3 centuries and then collapsed. The civilization of Kush lasted more than 3,000 years. That difference in durability is not accidental. A civilization oriented toward maintenance, toward the care of temples, the maintenance of rituals, the provision for the needs of both the living and the dead, has a different relationship with time than a civilization oriented toward extraction. Maintenance is sustainable, extraction is not. The slag heaps at Meroe, which may have contributed to the deforestation that contributed to the eventual collapse of the Meroitic state, complicate this picture in important ways, suggesting that even the civilization of Kush was not immune from the extractive tendencies that bring most ancient states eventually to their end. But the direction of the Kushite civilization across its long history was toward building and maintaining, not toward conquest and taking. And that orientation gave it a resilience that the empire of annals and iron reliefs could not match. The grief in the Taharqa story, the grief that the historian feels approaching the material from any direction, is not primarily about the Assyrian conquest. The conquest was terrible, and it was a loss, but it was a comprehensible loss, the kind of loss that ancient states routinely suffered at the hands of more powerful neighbors. The grief is about the second erasure, the modern one, the one that should not have happened, that happened anyway, and that we are still working to undo. A civilization that ruled Egypt, built more pyramids than Egypt, and maintained its identity for 3,000 years was reduced, in the standard accounts of the 19th and early 20th centuries, to a provincial footnote. The people who built the temples at Jebel Barkal and the pyramids at Nuri and the iron furnaces at Meroe were described, by the scholars who excavated their remains, as incapable of the achievements those remains documented. The gap between the evidence and the interpretation was not a scholarly error. It was a choice made repeatedly, institutionally, by people who considered it natural. We are still living in the world those choices made. The correction is ongoing, but the fact that it is necessary, the fact that a civilization this large and then accomplished requires, in the 21st century, advocates and defenders and documentarians who must argue for its basic significance against a default assumption of peripherality. That fact says something about the world we live in that no amount of scholarly correction has yet fully addressed. There is another dimension of the deeper truth that requires more time because it connects the specific story of Taharqa to the largest questions about civilizational fragility and the nature of historical memory. The civilization of Kush did not only suffer the particular modern erasure that has been described, it also suffered the universal fate of all civilizations. The slow attrition of time, the gradual collapse of complexity, the loss of the conditions that make sophisticated urban life possible. The Meroitic state did not collapse suddenly. It declined over generations, losing territory, losing population, losing the administrative capacity to maintain the infrastructure, the dams, the irrigation channels, the trade networks that supported urban density. The language disappeared. The script became unusable because there was no one left who could read it. The temples fell into disrepair because there was no one left to maintain them. The pyramids continued to be built for a while, getting smaller and less careful with each generation, until the tradition simply stopped because no one was left who knew how to continue it. Imagine if every university in Europe were abandoned in a single century. Not destroyed, just abandoned, their buildings standing but empty, their libraries intact but unread, their faculties dispersed into the surrounding countryside. The knowledge would not disappear immediately. The books would still be there. The instruments would still be there. But without the institutional structure that maintained the practice of reading and teaching and arguing about the texts, the knowledge would begin to erode. Within 2 or 3 generations, most of what the universities had preserved would become inaccessible. Within 5 generations, the capacity to recover it would be largely gone. That is what happened to the Meroitic tradition. Not in 2 or 3 generations, but across a longer period that had the same cumulative effect. The Meroitic script became unreadable, not because the tablets were destroyed, but because the institutions that maintained the practice of writing, the scribal schools, the royal court, the temple establishments, were no longer functioning. The knowledge of how to read Meroitic was not lost in a catastrophe. It was lost in the slow failure of the conditions that made it possible to know. This pattern, the slow institutional failure that precedes civilizational collapse, is not unique to Kush. It appears in the record of every major civilizational collapse in the ancient world. The Bronze Age collapse of roughly 1200 before the Common Era which brought down palace economies across the eastern Mediterranean. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era. The decline of the Mayan Classic period, which emptied the great cities of the Yucatan Peninsula over a period of perhaps 2 centuries. In every case, the institutional structures that maintained complexity began to fail before the physical fabric of the civilization was destroyed. The granaries stopped being filled, the irrigation channels stopped being maintained, the scribal schools stopped training new scribes. And then, over time, the physical fabric followed. The resonance of this pattern with the present moment is something that historians and archaeologists have been noting with increasing frequency in recent decades. The specific vulnerabilities vary. Drought and military pressure in the Bronze Age, institutional corruption and external migration pressure in the Roman case, drought and agricultural failure in the Mayan case. But the general structure of civilizational failure, the interdependence of complex systems, the way that failure in one system propagates through others, the speed with which complexity can unravel once the institutional buffers are gone, is recognizable across contexts and across millennia. The specific lesson of the Kushite case is perhaps this, that a civilization can be extraordinarily durable, can survive for 3,000 years, can adapt and transform and maintain its essential identity through enormous changes in its political situation, and still, ultimately, be vulnerable to the slow accumulation of pressures that exceeds its capacity to respond. Kush lasted 3,000 years. That is a number so large it is difficult to make fully real. 3,000 years from today would place us in the year 5000 of the Common Era, an almost unimaginable future. And yet the civilization of Kush maintained its essential continuity from Kerma to Napata to Meroe across precisely that span of time, and then it did not. The silence that followed the last Meritic king is one of the most complete silences in the archaeological record of the ancient world. There are no gradual transition documents, no records of one political system replacing another, no accounts of how the population of Meroe experienced the end of the kingdom they had known. There is the last pyramid, built with less care than the ones before it, and then there is nothing. The desert covered the city. The Nile continued to flood. The people who had been Meroitic citizens became something else, subjects of smaller local polities, eventually absorbed into the expanding Aksumite sphere, eventually part of the complex, multi-ethnic mosaic of the Nile Valley that would itself be transformed by the coming of Christianity in the 4th century and Islam in the 7th. The continuity and the discontinuity coexist in the same landscape. The people are still there, the pyramids are still there, the river is still there. What is gone is the framework, the royal dynasty, the scribal tradition, the specifically Meroitic way of organizing and understanding the world. What is gone is the name that the people called themselves, and the language in which they called it. Timothy Kendall, standing at the base of Jebel Barkal and looking up at the cliff face covered with 2,000 years of accumulated royal inscriptions, has said, "West, this is a place where human beings stood and looked at this mountain and felt, for 2,000 years, that they were in the presence of something divine. That experience is real. It happened. The people who had it are gone, and the language they described it in is gone, and we can barely read the inscriptions they left behind. But the mountain is still here. And when you stand at its base and look up at it in the right light, in the early morning or the late afternoon, when the shadow falls across the cliff face, and the inscriptions seem to emerge from the rock rather than be carved into it, you can feel something of what they felt. Not their specific theology, not their specific language, but the weight of the place, the sense that this is somewhere that matters. That is the closest thing to recovery we can offer the civilization of Kush. To stand in the places where they stood, to look at the things they looked at, to feel incompletely, inadequately, but genuinely the weight of what they built and what they believed and what they lost. The philosophical question that hovers over all of this, the question that the evidence of Kushite civilization forces into view, whether or not you want to examine it, is the question of what we owe to the dead. Not in a supernatural sense, in a historical sense. What obligations does the living world have to the civilizations that preceded it, that contributed to it, that were erased from its memory not by time but by choice. The conventional answer in academic discourse is that we owe accuracy. We owe the effort to recover what was lost, to correct the record where it was distorted, to describe what existed as clearly and completely as the evidence allows. This is necessary and important, but it may not be sufficient. The recovery of Kushite history as an academic project, as publications and conferences and revised textbook chapters, has been proceeding for decades without fundamentally changing the broader cultural reality, which is that most educated people in the world today have never heard of Taharqa and have no idea that there are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. Something more than academic recovery is needed. What is needed is integration, the incorporation of the Kushite story into the standard narratives of ancient history, into the curriculum at every level, into the popular culture of documentaries and museum exhibitions, and the books that people read for pleasure, not as a supplementary track, not as an elective topic for those with special interest in African history, but as a core component of the story of ancient civilization, because that is what it is. Kush is not a supplement to the story of Egypt and Mesopotamia and Greece. It is part of the same story. The same river that flows through the temples of Karnak flows past the pyramids of Meroe. The same tradition of royal ideology that the pharaohs of the New Kingdom practiced was maintained and developed by the kings at Jebel Barkal. The same trade networks that connected Egypt to the Mediterranean also connected Egypt to sub-Saharan Africa through the Kushite heartland. The ancient world was not divided into the civilizations that matter and the civilizations that are footnotes. That division was imposed by later scholarship, for reasons that had nothing to do with the ancient evidence and everything to do with the priorities of the modern world that produced the scholarship. The correction of that imposition is both a scholarly obligation and something more, a recognition that the past was richer and more complex and more African than the versions of it that have dominated the modern imagination. The grief of the Taharqa story is the grief of a civilization that deserved to be remembered and was not, that deserved to be taken seriously and was not, that left extraordinary evidence of its existence and had that evidence misread and minimized by the people who excavated it. The grief is real, and like all grief, it is not only about the past, it is about the present. It is about what it means to live in a world where the history of humanity has been systematically incomplete, where some stories have been told with great care and richness, and others have been buried twice, once by time and once by choice. The reckoning with that grief, and with the choices that produced it, is ongoing. It is happening in the scholarly literature, and in the museums, and in the documentaries, and in the conversations that happen in schools and homes and online. It is happening, in some small way, in every telling of Taharqa's story that takes seriously the full scope of what he was and what he represented. He was not a footnote. He was a pharaoh. He was the ruler of the most powerful state in the world at his time. He came from a civilization that lasted 3,000 years and left more pyramids than Egypt. His name was written in stone on buildings that are still standing. His story is part of the story of all of us who live in the world that ancient civilization built. That he was forgotten is a wound. That we are remembering him is at least a beginning. There is a particular kind of knowledge that changes the way you look at the world, not dramatically and not immediately, but permanently. You carry it with you into situations where it was not originally relevant, and find that it quietly reframes what you see. Learning about Taharqa and Kush is that kind of knowledge. Once you understand that the story of ancient civilization, the story most of us were taught as children, the story of Egypt and Greece and Rome and the empires of Mesopotamia, is an incomplete story, missing one of its most important chapters, you begin to see the incompleteness everywhere. You see it when you walk through a museum's Ancient Egypt gallery and notice that the section on the 25th dynasty is 2 panels long, while the New Kingdom section fills an entire room. You see it when a documentary about the pyramids discusses the monuments at Giza for 45 minutes and spends 30 seconds mentioning that there are similar structures in Sudan. You see it when a history textbook describes the Assyrian Empire's conquest of Egypt and identifies the pharaoh it drove out as simply an Ethiopian ruler. The word Ethiopian functioning, as it so often does in classical and modern sources, as a vague gesture toward African geography, rather than as a description of a specific person from a specific civilization with a specific history. The incompleteness is everywhere, once you know to look for it. And the question it raises is not only the historical one, what did we miss, and why? But the contemporary one, what are we still missing? What other stories are we telling incompletely? What other civilizations are we treating as peripheral when the evidence would support a more generous accounting? The archaeology of the ancient world is perpetually unfinished. This is not a counsel of despair. It is, among other things, part of what makes the field so exciting. New excavations, new analytical techniques, new interpretive frameworks are constantly generating data that challenges existing accounts. The ground-penetrating radar surveys at Meroe, the DNA analysis of skeletal remains from Kushite burial sites, the new excavation campaigns at Nuri using water-pumping technology to access the flooded chambers. Each of these is contributing to a picture of ancient African civilization that is more detailed, more specific, and more impressive than any previous version of the account. But the transformation of scholarly knowledge into general cultural knowledge is slow, uneven, and dependent on factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the research. A discovery that changes the understanding of Kushite civilization must make its way from the specialist journal through the popular science press, through the documentary-making process, through the educational curriculum before it reaches the general public, a journey that typically takes decades and that many discoveries never complete. The knowledge that there are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt has been available in the scholarly literature for more than 100 years. It still surprises most people when they encounter it. This gap between what is known and what is widely known is not merely an educational challenge. It reflects something about the architecture of cultural memory, about which stories are told as central and which are told as marginal, which civilizations are considered part of the default human story, and which are considered special topics requiring active pursuit. Changing the architecture is a longer, harder project than changing the content of a specific textbook chapter. It requires changing the assumptions that determine which chapters get expanded and which get compressed. The connection between the opening of this story and where we have arrived is now fully visible. The hook was a face in stone at Karnak, the face of a pharaoh most visitors walk past without recognition. The journey from that face to here has taken us through the full arc of a civilization. The Kushite kingdom's deep roots at Kerma, the Napatan dynasty's religious devotion at Jebel Barkal, the extraordinary rule of the 25th dynasty in Egypt, the Assyrian conquest and its aftermath, the continued life of Kush at Meroe for a further 1,000 years, the modern scholarship that has only recently begun to give this civilization the seriousness it deserves. And we have arrived at a recognition. The face in the stone at Karnak is not a detail, it is a provocation. It is asking us to pay attention to a story that we have, for too long, walked past. What does this story mean for the present? The direct political lessons of ancient history are almost always simplistic and usually misleading. The ancient world was different enough from ours that any direct analogy is likely to obscure more than it reveals. But there is a kind of structural lesson available here that does not require a direct analogy. It is this: the account of the past that a culture maintains shapes the range of possibilities it can imagine for the future. A culture that tells itself a story of ancient civilization that includes only certain peoples and excludes others is a culture that has already, at some level, constrained the range of human possibilities it can imagine. Correcting the historical record is therefore not only an act of respect for the dead, it is an act of imagination for the living. The civilization of Kush achieved things that, by the assumptions of the world that excavated it, should not have been achievable. That is what makes it so important. Not because it requires new superlatives, not because we need to argue that it was the greatest or the first or the most impressive of the ancient civilizations. It does not require any of those claims. It simply requires that it be included in the story, that the standard account of what human beings have managed to build and maintain and imagine and sustain make room for what actually happened along the Sudanese Nile across 3,000 years. That room is being made, slowly, imperfectly, with the usual friction and resistance that any correction of a long-established narrative encounters. But the correction is happening. The story is expanding. Taharqa is being remembered. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves to be part of the reflection because it connects the ancient past to the most urgent questions of the present in a way that is not forced or analogical, but genuinely structural. The civilization of Kush survived for 3,000 years along a single river in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It survived by maintaining the relationship between human settlement and the natural systems that supported it. The Nile flood cycle, the desert ecology, the trade networks that distributed resources across a vast territory. The evidence for the civilization's eventual collapse includes evidence of environmental degradation. The deforestation around Meroe, the possible soil exhaustion of intensively farmed river margins. That suggests the limits of what even the most carefully maintained ancient state could sustain over centuries of intensive use. That pattern, a long-enduring civilization that eventually exceeds the capacity of its environment to support it, is not unique to Kush. It appears in the collapse of multiple ancient states across multiple continents, and the general structure of the pattern is not irrelevant to a world currently grappling with the long-term sustainability of its own relationship to the natural systems it depends on. This is not an argument for despair, it is an argument for attention. The ruins of Meroe are not a prophecy, they are a data point. They are evidence of what happens when the relationship between a civilization and its environment becomes unsustainable over a long enough period. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, through the accumulation of small deficits that do not individually register as catastrophic until they have collectively produced a collapse. The Kushite story is also a story about what endures. Not every civilization that builds pyramids falls into complete oblivion. The people of the Nile Valley in northern Sudan are still there. They speak Arabic now, the language that came with Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era, and they practice Islam. But they live in the same landscape, drink from the same river, look at the same mountain at Jebel Barkal that their ancestors looked at for 3,000 years and called the home of the god. The genetic continuity between modern Sudanese populations and the ancient Kushite population of the same region has been confirmed by archaeological DNA studies in ways that the scientists conducting those studies describe as surprisingly strong. The population that maintained the civilization of Kush did not disappear when the civilization fell. They stayed, they adapted, they are still there. This is perhaps the most hopeful element of the entire Taharqa story. Civilizations fall, languages die, scripts become unreadable, institutional structures collapse. But the people remain, the landscape remains, and sometimes, imperfectly, incompletely, through the patient work of scholars and the slower work of cultural recovery, the story can be told again. Not in the language it was first told in, not in the script that was developed to record it, but in a language that the living can understand, using categories that the living can engage with, recovering enough of the substance to make it real. The ground beneath the Sudanese desert is thick, with the remains of people who lived and worked and prayed and built and died. Most of what they built is still there, buried at varying depths, waiting for the excavators who have not yet come. The story they lived is mostly unrecoverable in its specific detail, but its broad outline, the extraordinary arc of a civilization that rose from the banks of the Nile more than 3,000 years ago, reached the heights of pharaonic power, survived defeat and transformation, and continued for a further 1,000 years. That outline is recoverable, is being recovered, is being told. This is the thing about history that never stops being true. What was real does not stop having been real. The temples Taharqa built were built. They are built. The prayers he prayed were prayed. The floods that confirmed his mandate happened. The gods he served, whatever one believes about the nature of divinity, were genuinely served by a man who believed in them completely and spent his life in their service. These things are not negated by the Assyrian conquest. They are not negated by the modern erasure. They are not negated by the rising groundwater in the burial chambers at Nuri. They happened, and the evidence that they happened is there, in the stone of the temples, and the silence of the desert, and the single column at Karnak that is still standing. The arc of this story has moved from a face in stone to a civilization, from a civilization to a king to a defeat, from a defeat to a persistence that lasted 1,000 years after the defeat, from that persistence to a modern erasure, from the erasure to the slow, imperfect, ongoing recovery of a record that should never have been obscured in the first place. That arc is not tidy. History is never tidy, but it has a shape, and the shape is not one of simple loss. It is one of loss and recovery, of erasure and return, of the stone outlasting the chisel that tried to remove the name from the stone. Taharqa's name was hacked from walls by Assyrian soldiers following orders. For 2,500 years, the blank spaces and the overwritten cartouches told the story that the Assyrian kings wanted told, a story of their own supremacy, of the irrelevance of the figure they had defeated. And then, slowly, the scholars arrived, and then the excavators arrived, and then the imaging technology arrived that could reveal what was underneath the later inscriptions, that could read the ghost of a name in the chisel marks left by its removal, and the name came back. That is the most powerful metaphor available in the entire Kushite story. The name that was chiseled out came back, not because it was preserved in some other document, not because a library had a copy, but because the act of removing it left visible traces in the stone. The removal was its own record. The destruction was its own archaeology. We are reading the chisel marks. We are reconstructing the name, Taharqa, Black Pharaoh from Nubia, ruler of the most powerful empire in the ancient world, builder of monuments that are still standing, representative of a civilization that deserved better than the world gave it, and is, slowly, finally, beginning to receive what it was owed. There is a field on the west bank of the Nile in Sudan, downstream from the village of Nuri, where the desert is flat and the sky in the late afternoon turns a shade of gold that feels ancient in itself. If you stand in that field and know what you are looking at, you are standing beside one of the most important burial grounds in the ancient world. Beneath the surface, in chambers carved from bedrock, lie the remains of the rulers of the most durable kingdom sub-Saharan Africa ever produced. They lie in chambers that rising groundwater has partially filled, their burial goods mingling with silt and mud in the slow underwater darkness. Some of the chambers have been excavated, most have not. The largest pyramid at the northern end of the royal cemetery covers the burial of the greatest king the dynasty ever produced. Taharqa is there. The stone of his pyramid has been eroded by centuries of wind and occasional rain. The superstructure is largely destroyed. What is visible today is the eroded base and the lower courses of the pyramid body, enough to indicate scale but far short of the original form. Beneath it, the burial chamber. Beneath the chamber, the groundwater. The title of this story asked a direct question. Who was Taharqa, the Black Pharaoh from Nubia? By now the answer is clear enough to be stated plainly. Taharqa was a pharaoh of Egypt. Not a pharaoh in a diminished or honorary sense, but in the full ancient, theologically grounded, politically complete sense of the word. He wore the double crown of the two lands in a ceremony of legitimate coronation, conducted by the priests of Amun at Thebes. He exercised real administrative authority over a territory stretching from the Mediterranean to the Sudanese interior. He collected the taxes, maintained the temples, directed the military, commissioned the buildings, and fulfilled every obligation that the pharaonic office required across a reign of 26 years. He was recognized as pharaoh by his contemporaries, by the Egyptian priests who crowned him, by the local rulers who submitted to him, by the Assyrian kings who fought him, and by the Hebrew prophets who mentioned him in the texts that would become the Bible. He was also a king of Kush, the heir and representative of a civilization that was, by the time he came to the throne of Egypt, already older than 3,000 years. He came from Napata, from the shadow of Jebel Barkal, from a tradition of royal ideology and religious practice that had been developing along the Sudanese Nile since the earliest period of the Kerma culture. He understood himself as the product of this tradition. He built monuments in Sudan as well as in Egypt. He brought his Kushite identity with him to the throne, maintained it there, and carried it back with him when the Assyrians drove him south. He was not a Cushite who became Egyptian. He was both, simultaneously, and he never pretended otherwise. He was a builder of the first order. The single remaining column of his Karnak colonnade is 21 meters of sandstone that has stood through every subsequent revolution in the Nile Valley. Through the Persian conquest, through the Greek conquest, through the Roman conquest, through the Arab conquest, through the Ottoman period and the European colonial period and the formation of the modern nation-states of Egypt and Sudan. It is still standing. It will probably still be standing when many of the buildings in every city on earth have returned to the ground. That is what it means to build with stone and faith and the full weight of a civilization behind you. He was, finally, a man who was erased. First by his enemies, then by scholars, then by the accumulated weight of a cultural tradition that decided his story was peripheral. And he is at last being remembered, not fully, not completely, not in every textbook or every documentary or every museum label where his name should appear and does not, but increasingly, carefully, by the scholars who have spent their careers at the excavation sites in Sudan, and by the institutions that support them, and by the people all over the world who encounter his story for the first time and feel the specific astonishment of learning that what they thought they knew was incomplete. The one scaled comparison that puts this entire story in perspective is this. Kush endured for more than 3,000 years. The entire span of recorded European history, from the Greeks to the present, is approximately 3,000 years. The civilization of Kush was running, building, trading, governing, and maintaining its identity across a span of time equivalent to the entire history of Western civilization. Most people have never heard of it. That single comparison is the most powerful argument for why this story matters. Not the argument about justice, though that argument is valid. Not the argument about the correction of historical racism, though that argument is important. The simple argument about scale. A civilization that lasted as long as European recorded history, that built more pyramids than Egypt, that ruled Egypt for 50 years, and maintained its identity for 3,000. That civilization deserves to be part of the default account of what human beings have accomplished. Full stop. The last thing to say about Taharqa is something that no amount of scholarship can fully recover, but that the evidence suggests is true. He believed in what he was doing. The inscriptions, the building program, the religious dedications, the extraordinary detail of the Kawawa texts, with their account of the floods and the rains that the god sent to confirm his mandate, all of this points to a man who was not performing piety as political theatre, but who genuinely believed that the correct maintenance of the temples was the most important thing a ruler could do, who spent 26 years and enormous resources on that belief, who was driven from the kingdom where he had acted on that belief, and who went home to Kush and died in the conviction that what he had built was real, that what he had done mattered, that the god had received what he had given. Whether the god received it is not something history can determine. What history can determine is that the stone received it. The stone is still there. The column is still there. The name, hacked from some walls and preserved in others, is still there. Walk past the column at Karnak if you like. Look at it once and look away. But if you stop, if you let its height make itself real to you, if you let the 2,500 years between its building and your standing in front of it make itself real, you will feel something. The weight of a name that was nearly lost. The weight of a civilization that was more than we were told. The weight of the earth beneath you, thick with the remains of lives as full and as real as yours, waiting in the silence for someone to remember. The stone keeps the record. The silence is not the end of the story. It never was. End of script. Total word count. See file count below. There is one more thing worth saying quietly before the silence comes. The people who live near Jebel Barkal today, in the towns and villages along the Nile north of Khartoum, in the communities that have lived in this landscape for generations, sometimes tell visitors that the mountain is not simply a geological feature. They say it is alive. Not alive in the sense that would require a particular theology to accept, but alive in the sense that a place can be alive when human beings have cared about it deeply enough and long enough that the caring becomes part of the place itself. 2,000 years of prayers, of inscriptions, of processional festivals in which the divine statue was carried out of the temple and shown to the crowd, of kings carving their names into the cliff face and adding their small mark to the accumulated record. 2,000 years of attention have made Jebel Barkal into something that is more than a rock. It is a record of the human need to make meaning in a landscape. It is the physical trace of a civilization's conversation with the divine, conducted over a span of time that makes the entire written history of most nations look like a footnote. That conversation is over. The priests who conducted it are gone. The language they conducted it in is gone. The specific theology they practiced is gone. But the mountain is there. The inscriptions are there. The morning light falls on the cliff face the way it has fallen every morning for 3,000 years, illuminating the carved signs that human hands put there for reasons we can only partially recover. Those signs are not only the historical record of a lost civilization, they are also a message, not a theological message, not a message that requires any specific belief to receive, but a simple human message. We were here. We looked at this mountain. We believed it was important. We tried to make something that would last. We tried to leave a mark that would outlast us. The mark lasted. The chisel marks of the Assyrian erasure lasted. The column at Karnak lasted. The pyramids at Nuri and Meroe and El Kuru lasted. Taharqa lasted. In stone, in inscription, in the careful records of the scholars who have spent their lives at these sites, in the telling and retelling of a story that the world tried, for a long time, to stop telling. It did not stop. It could not be stopped because the stone was there, and stone, when it is cared for, outlasts everything. It outlasts empires, and it outlasts the scholars who study empires, and it will outlast the moment of this telling. What was built in faith and in stone and in the full conviction that the god would receive it, that does not disappear. It waits. In the desert, in the flooded chambers, in the single column at Karnak that nobody walks past by accident, even if they do not know whose column it is. They stop, they look up, they feel the height. That feeling is the last trace of Taharqa in the world, the feeling that stops a person in front of a stone column in a ruined temple and makes them look up. Not at the pharaoh's name, not at the dynasty or the conquest or the scholarship, just at the height of the thing that was built, and the fact that it is still standing, and the question that the height asks of anyone who stops long enough to hear it: what do you build that will outlast you?